Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The sun dipped below the endless horizon of Montana, casting a fading golden light over the winding road. Maya leaned her head against the window, her fingers tracing the edge of a worn map. The hum of the tires on asphalt was comforting, a rhythm they had come to rely on after hours of driving. Beside her, Liam gripped the steering wheel with an anxious determination. "We should have taken the highway exit back there," Maya murmured, glancing at her phone's GPS. But the screen flickered, a momentary glitch that left her with nothing but static and an eerie silence. The bright blue dot on the map had disappeared. "It's fine," Liam said, his voice strained but steady. "We're cutting through some back roads, but I know where we're going. It'll save time." The words barely left his lips before the road forked, an old sign half hidden by overgrown vines directing them toward an unfamiliar path. The road was narrow, twisting like a serpent through thick trees that closed in on both sides. It was the perfect shortcut, or so it seemed. Maya squinted at the fading letters on the sign. "I don't think I've seen this road before." Liam shrugged, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had never been the type to back out once. A decision was made. "It's just a small detour. We'll be back on track in no time." As they drove deeper into the wild, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating with an unnatural stillness. The trees overhead, once vibrant and full of life, now cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The occasional rustling in the underbrush didn't sound like animals, but something heavier, something more deliberate. Maya turned to look at Liam. "Something's off about this place." But before she could say more, a sudden flash of light cut through the trees. Startled, Liam slammed on the brakes. The car jerked to a halt, and for a heartbeat everything stood still. Ahead, in the dim light, a mile marker loomed, its numbers glowing faintly in the twilight. The odd thing was, it read 77. Liam blinked. "That's, strange. We're only 10 miles from the last marker." He reached for his phone again, but the GPS was still unresponsive. Maya's heart pounded. "That can't be right," she said, voice shaking. She pressed her hands against the cold window, straining her eyes to peer ahead. In the distance, the road stretched out, empty, quiet, like it had been waiting for them. But waiting for what? They continued forward, neither of them mentioning the oddity. But it lingered, a feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. But just as they turned the corner, the road ahead shimmered in the fading twilight. The same marker, the same number. Mile 77. Maya froze, her throat constricted. But before she could speak, the road began to narrow, twisting around unseen turns. She could feel her breath quicken, could taste the fear that began to claw its way up her spine. The trees pressed closer, the path growing tighter, and the same mile marker, 77, kept appearing in the distance like a cruel joke. What was happening? What was wrong with the road? The world seemed to close in on them. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the fog rolled in, thick, suffocating, clinging to the air, like it had been waiting for them. The strange number didn't change. The road stretched on, but what waited ahead was still unknown. The fog had settled like a shroud, thick and suffocating, pressing down on them, obscuring the road ahead. Maya clutched the seatbelt, the tension in her chest rising with each mile. Her eyes darted nervously between the darkening trees and the lonely stretch of highway. The eerie quiet of the world around them made her feel as though they were the only two people left alive. Liam kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his eyes flicking from the road to the repeating mile markers. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked, 7:46 p.m. But something about the night felt wrong. The darkness seemed too thick, too heavy, pressing in from all sides. "This isn't right," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. She tried to shake off the growing dread, but it wrapped itself tighter around her chest. "We've passed this same marker 4 times now. How is that possible?" Liam's brow furrowed. He glanced at the marker again, the faded numbers reflecting off the headlights. 77. "Must be some kind of glitch," he said, though the words felt hollow, like he was trying to convince himself more than her. He reached for his phone again, but it was still useless, nothing but static. Maybe the GPS is malfunctioning. We'll get out of this soon. But Maya wasn't so sure. Her hands trembled as she checked her own phone. Still no signal, still no connection. She had tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion crawling along the back of her mind, but it was becoming harder to dismiss. The trees around them seemed to loom larger now, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws, stretching and twisting into shapes that could have been animals or something darker. The air was colder too, the temperature dropping without warning, and Maya couldn't help but rub her arms in an attempt to ward off the chill. Then, just as they passed the marker, for the 5th time she saw it, the faintest shimmer, a distortion in the air just beyond the windshield, as if the road itself was bending around them. "Did you see that?" Maya's voice was a sharp whisper. Liam didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The silence between them was thick with unease. The world outside had grown unnervingly still. The trees were motionless. Even the wind had stopped. Maya blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the bizarre sensation creeping over her. There it was again, an unnatural shift in the air, like something was watching them. "Liam." Her voice was barely audible, but it trembled with fear. "This isn't just a glitch. We're stuck. We've been stuck." His eyes flicked to her, the confusion clear on his face. "What are you talking about?" But before Maya could answer, a low rumble echoed from somewhere, ahead of them. At first, it seemed like the distant sound of thunder, but there was no lightning, no storm to explain it. It came again, louder, deeper, like the growl of something huge, something unseen. Maya's heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" Liam nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes wide now. "Yeah. What the hell is that?" Suddenly the road seemed to stretch longer, as though it was pulling them forward. They had passed mile 77 at least 6 times by now, but no matter how far they drove, the marker never changed. It was as if the road was looping, keeping them trapped in the same place. The growl returned, this time much closer. The trees along the side of the road creaked and groaned as though something was moving between them. Something heavy, something massive. The hairs on the back of Maya's neck stood on end. "Liam, stop the car," Maya whispered, panic rising in her chest. He didn't respond immediately. His hands were gripped tightly on the wheel, his knuckles white. The growl intensified, a deep guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. With a sudden jolt, the car lurched forward, the brakes screeching in protest. Maya grabbed the dashboard as they skidded to a halt, the tires leaving a long mark in the dirt. "Why did you stop?" Maya exclaimed, her voice rising in panic. Liam was frozen, his wide eyes locked on the rearview mirror. He didn't answer, but the terror in his face spoke volumes. The growl grew louder still, unmistakable now. It was coming from behind them, from the trees, and the low rumble of its proximity shook the car. "Go," Maya said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Liam's hands trembled as he shifted the car into drive, but when he pressed the gas pedal, nothing happened. The engine sputtered as though something was holding it back. The headlights flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows across the empty road. The growl had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. But that wasn't the worst of it. What was worse was the reflection in the rearview mirror. The trees were no longer just trees. They were figures, shapes that moved with unsettling fluidity like shadows given form, slowly creeping toward the car. And in the distance, the faint glow of something red, eyes perhaps, staring, unblinking, as if it had been there all along. The car was motionless. The engine sputtered once more, then fell into a deafening silence. Maya's breath was shallow, her heart hammering against her chest. The headlights flickered erratically, casting a ghostly light over the road and the shifting trees that now seemed to move with purpose, closing in from all sides. The unsettling glow from behind them, those eyes, had vanished, but Maya could still feel them, watching, waiting. "Liam, what's happening?" Her voice was thin, strained with fear, but it barely broke through the thick, suffocating quiet that pressed in on them. Liam didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline, his knuckles pale against the darkness. His eyes were wide with disbelief, as though he couldn't fathom what was unfolding in front of him. It was then that the fog rolled in. Dense, thick, like the very air was alive, creeping up from the ground and enveloping everything in its path. The fog wasn't natural. It didn't move like the mist of early mornings in the valley. This fog, this darkness pressed. It clung to the car's windows, swirling, twisting, as if something unseen was guiding it toward them. Maya could taste it now, the sharp, metallic tang of something wrong, something foul, lingering in the air like a poison that had settled into her lungs. She leaned forward, peering through the windshield, but the world ahead was swallowed up by the fog. It felt like they were floating, drifting on a river of fog that had no end. The road, the trees, even the night sky, everything had vanished. "Liam," Maya said again, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch his arm, her hand cold, as if the temperature had plummeted without warning. Her skin felt clammy, damp with fear. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something beyond the veil of fog. Maya followed his gaze, but all she could see was an impenetrable white. It was as though they had driven straight into the belly of the unknown, where time and place no longer mattered. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the soft sound of the car's engine idling, the occasional creak of the wheels against the pavement. But there was something else too, a sound so faint at first it could have been a figment of her imagination, a soft scraping noise. Maya's breath caught in her throat. It came again, sharper this time, dragging across the car's roof with a slow, deliberate force. She looked up, but the fog was too thick to make out any shapes above them. Her pulse quickened. "Liam, do you hear that?" Liam's lips parted, as if he were about to say something, but then his eyes widened in alarm, and his gaze snapped to the rearview mirror. Maya followed his stare, but the mirror reflected only the endless stretch of fog. Still, the sound was there, closer now. It was unmistakable, the scraping growing louder, more insistent. Whatever it was moving on top of the car. And then came a whisper, a low, sibilant hiss that seemed to crawl into her ears, slithering like a serpent through the quiet. "Turn back." Maya's blood ran cold. The voice was not human, not even close. It was otherworldly, distorted and thick with malice. She twisted in her seat, but there was nothing behind them except the suffocating whiteness of the fog. "Liam, we need to go. Now." Her voice was higher now, panic bubbling beneath her words, but Liam didn't move. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He was frozen, staring straight ahead, eyes wide, locked on something just beyond the fog. Something in the distance. Maya reached forward, shaking him, her fingers grazing his arm. "Liam, please, what are you seeing? What's—" And then he spoke. His voice was hollow, distant. "It's not the road. We can't leave." Maya recoiled, her heart lurching in her chest. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" But before Liam could answer, a sudden bang erupted from the car's roof. The force of it shook the entire vehicle and Maya gasped, her body jerking back. The scraping intensified, the sound of claws, or something far worse, digging into the metal. It was relentless, loud, as if someone was dragging itself across the car. The fog parted just for a moment, revealing a silhouette. A figure, something, loomed at the edge of their headlights, just beyond the reach of the fading light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its shape bending and contorting in ways that made Maya's stomach twist. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to shift as though it were never truly solid. And then it moved, not forward, not back. It simply moved through the air, gliding with an unnatural speed, as though gravity had no hold on it. "Liam." "Please!" Maya cried, her voice breaking. But Liam was staring at the figure, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to speak, trying to break free from whatever hold it had over him. The figure glided closer, its form shifting with each passing second, and as it reached the car, the scraping noise intensified, now followed by a slow, unnerving chant. "Leave, leave, leave." Maya's pulse was deafening in her ears. She turned the handle of the door, locked. The handle twisted uselessly in her hand. She yanked at it again, desperation rising like a tidal wave. And then, suddenly, it was right there. The figure, no more than a shadow now, lingered just beyond the headlights, its shape flickering and twisting in ways that defied the laws of nature. Maya's breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking violently as she turned the handle again, but it didn't budge. The whispering chant, "Leave, leave, leave," echoed in her mind, reverberating in the very air around her, as though the words themselves were alive. "Please, Liam. Please, we have to go," she begged, her voice trembling in fear. But Liam didn't move. He was staring straight ahead, unblinking, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He seemed locked in place, as though the creature, or whatever it was, had frozen him in its gaze. Maya shook him urgently, but he didn't respond. His eyes, wide and empty, were fixed on the figure in the fog. A sudden, sharp bang on the roof of the car jolted her, and the scraping resumed, now accompanied by a low growl that seemed to resonate deep in her bones. It sounded close, dangerously close, as though something, or someone, was inching toward them from all sides, pressing in. Then, through the fog, something else appeared. A flicker of light. In the distance, barely visible through the thick, oppressive mist, a dim glow pulsed, a sign of civilization, a sign of escape. Maya's heart leaped in her chest, her instincts screaming that it was their only chance. She didn't know what it was, couldn't tell. But the desperate need for something real, something human, pushed her forward. "Liam, look, do you see that? It's a gas station. We have to get there." Her words cut through the fog like a lifeline, and to her surprise, Liam stirred, his head jerking slightly, as if snapping out of a trance. He turned toward the lights, his eyes blinking, finally focusing on the distant glow. Without a word, he slammed the car into gear, his foot pressing down on the gas pedal. The engine roared to life, and the tires screeched against the asphalt as the car lurched forward, heading toward the light. The fog didn't let up, but the gas station grew nearer, its outline taking shape, a decrepit old structure, abandoned, but still lit. The flickering neon sign above the pumps buzzed weakly, casting an eerie greenish hue over the scene. The lights inside the building were on, and yet there was no movement, no sound, no sign of life. Maya's stomach twisted in discomfort, but she forced herself to keep her eyes on the station. There was something oddly inviting about it, something that promised relief, even if she wasn't sure what they would find. Liam slowed the car as they neared the pumps, the tires crunching on gravel, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence. The scraping noise from above had stopped, but the whispers didn't fade. They lingered in the air, just on the edge of her hearing, as though the very ground beneath them was breathing. The car came to a stop. The headlights illuminated the gas station, revealing cracked windows, peeling paint, and a rusted, faded, open sign swinging in the breeze. There was no one there, no attendant, no cars, nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint buzzing of the lights. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt, her legs trembling as she stepped out of the car. The cold air hit her like a slap, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she could breathe. The mist had thinned here, but it still hung around the edges of the station like a heavy fog, drifting in and out of view. "What are we doing here?" Liam's voice was strained, distant, as though the drive had taken something from him. He sounded as if he were trying to convince himself to stay in the car, to not go inside. "We need gas," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. Her gaze flicked nervously to the dark windows of the station. "We need help." Liam hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door. The place looked deserted. No movement, no sign of life. But where is everyone? Why isn't anyone here? Her gaze followed his, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw something move behind the glass, just a shadow, a flicker, but when she blinked, it was gone. "Maybe they're inside," she said, trying to push the fear down. "Come on, let's just see if we can get some answers." She didn't wait for his response. She made her way to the door, feeling its cold surface under her fingertips as she pushed it open. The bell above the door chimed faintly, the sound strange in the otherwise silent air. Inside, the station was dim, with only the fluorescent lights, above casting a faint glow on the aisles of dusty, forgotten items. Shelves lined the walls, filled with cans of food, bags of chips, and odd, broken-down goods that had seen better days. The air smelled stale, thick with dust, and a faint metallic tang, like rust left too long in the damp. "Hello?" Maya called, out, her voice echoing through the empty space. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, the quiet stretching out like a rubber band ready to snap. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. She took a few tentative steps further into the station, Liam following hesitantly behind her, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of life. But there was nothing, only the strange emptiness that seemed to have settled in every corner. Maya approached the counter, her eyes scanning the register. It was empty, the surface covered in a thin layer of dust. But there was something off behind the counter. A radio sat, its static crackling. For the first time in hours, the sound of something normal reached her ears. The buzz of an old device, an attempt to offer comfort in the midst of the unknown. She moved closer, her hand shaking as she reached for the knob and turned it. The static wavered, then shifted, the sound morphing into something more distinct, something she hadn't expected. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. Maya froze. The words were sharp, cold, as though they were meant for her, meant for them. A deep, bone-chilling sense of dread filled her chest. Liam stepped up beside her, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Her heart was pounding in her throat. The voice, it wasn't just a broadcast, it was a warning, and before she could say another word, she heard the sound that froze her in place. The door to the gas station slammed shut behind them. The door slammed with a deafening crash, echoing through the empty station like a gunshot. Maya's body jerked at the sound and she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The air was thick now, heavier, more oppressive, like the gas station itself was somehow closing in on them. Her mind raced, but nothing made sense. The door hadn't moved on its own. Someone had closed it from the outside. Had someone followed them inside? Who? Who shut that? Liam asked, his voice strained, almost hoarse. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She could barely bring herself to turn back to the door, but the instinct to flee was stronger than the rational part of her mind. She stepped toward it, her feet dragging, as though the very floor was holding her in place. The handle, still cold, still solid, was locked. "No one is here," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "We were just in the car, no one else was around, but the wind was something else entirely. It wasn't natural. It didn't feel like it was coming from outside, but from within, swirling through the aisles of the station, moving like it had a mind of its own. It rushed past them, a cold gust that cut through the layers of their clothing, chilling them to the bone. And it wasn't just the wind, it was the whispering. At first, Maya thought it was just the rush of air, the creak of the old building settling, but no. The whispers were more distinct now, too clear to be a coincidence, too deliberate to be ignored. Low, breathless voices that seemed to hover in the air just beyond her hearing. It's too late. "Leave now." Maya froze, the words slicing through her thoughts like shards of ice. She turned to Liam, her wide eyes searching his face for an answer. He was staring straight ahead, his lips parted as if listening intently. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling, "do you hear it?" His gaze flickered over to her, but there was a blankness in his eyes now, something that made her blood run cold. He didn't speak, but the look on his face, pale, hollow, spoke volumes. The whispers grew louder, closer, as if the air itself was carrying the voices around them, surrounding them. It was as if the wind had come alive, bending the very walls to its will. She could feel it now, a creeping chill inching its way down her spine, making her skin crawl. Come closer, Maya." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded so clear, so familiar, and yet it wasn't her own. It was someone else's. Someone who knew her name. She spun around, her breath catching, eyes wide. Nothing. Nothing but the rows of dusty shelves, the flickering neon lights, the forgotten snacks that filled the aisles. But something in the air had changed. The temperature had dropped even further, and the silence was more than just an absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that suffocated. Liam stepped back, his gaze still distant, unfocused. "Maya, I don't..." His voice trailed off, but she could see the confusion in his eyes, the way they darted around the room as though he couldn't make sense of where he was. The wind picked up again, a low, howling rush that made the windows rattle. Maya's pulse quickened as the whispers returned, now urgent, frantic. "Turn around, Maya. Turn around." Her breath hitched. That voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was calling to her. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to see what was behind her. But it was as if the whispers were pulling at her, dragging her toward the unknown. She couldn't fight it. Her body moved of its own accord, every instinct screaming for her to stay away. But the whispers were in her head now, filling her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. "Turn around." Against her will, Maya's feet carried her back toward the counter. She reached for the radio again, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the dial. The static was louder now, more desperate, and as she twisted the knob, the voice finally broke through. "If you're hearing this, it's already too late." Maya's hand shot back as though the radio itself had burned her. Her eyes were wide, panic surging through her, but something made her glance toward the door. She was not alone. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the flickering lights, was a figure, a shadow, tall and thin, standing unnaturally still, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It was as though the shadow was part of the fog itself, stretching and bending in ways that couldn't belong to the physical world, and its eyes, those eyes, were glowing, faint and red, like the embers of a fire, long since gone out. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Maya's breath caught in her throat, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The whispers grew louder again, more frantic, more insistent, pressing in from all sides. Leave. Leave now. But her legs wouldn't move. Her body was frozen, caught in the grip of something she couldn't comprehend. Liam, still standing behind her, was motionless as well, his expression vacant, as if the very air of the station had drained him of any will to resist. And then, as if on cue, the shadow shifted. It stretched forward, slithering across the floor in unnatural ways. Maya couldn't look away. Her entire body screamed for her to run, to flee, but it was too late. The thing, whatever it was coming closer, its form warping with each passing second, growing larger, more tangible. The whispers filled the air like 1,000 voices, the words now sharp and clear, unmistakable. We've been waiting for you. Maya's pulse raced. She backed away slowly, her mind reeling. But every step she took was met with a shifting sound, a scrape of something wet against the floor. Something was crawling beneath the floorboards, moving with an unnatural rhythm. Her breathing quickened, but before she could turn, before she could even scream, the world around her went dark. The gas station, the shadow, the whispers, all of it vanished in a single heartbeat, and then, all at once, there was nothing. Maya's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sharp and shallow, as though the very air had been stolen from her lungs. The darkness around her was absolute, suffocating. There was no sound, nothing. The quiet was unnerving, a heavy, stifling weight that pressed down on her chest, making her feel like she was drowning in the absence of everything she had once known. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the blackness seemed endless, stretching out in all directions like the void itself had swallowed them whole. The silence was deafening. Her pulse thudded in her ears, so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. The last thing she remembered, no, the only thing she remembered, was the figure, the shadow. It had reached for her, its glowing eyes piercing the dark with an unnatural fire. She could still feel the cold presence of it, lingering in her skin, pressing into her bones, like a weight that refused to let go. And Liam, where was Liam? She turned her head, her hands trembling as she reached out, feeling the air around her, searching for any sign of him. The emptiness was overwhelming, suffocating. Her fingertips brushed against something cold, solid. The counter of the gas station. But it was wrong now. It didn't feel like the same place, the same building. The smooth surface of the counter felt different under her hand, slippery, as if coated in something wet. The faint smell of rust and decay lingered in the air, along with something darker, more rancid. A distant sound echoed, faint at first, like a voice lost in the wind. Her heart skipped a beat. Was someone else here? She spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one. No figure, no shadow, just the endless blackness. But then the noise came again, clearer this time. A soft hum, followed by the unmistakable static of a radio. The radio. Without thinking, Maya scrambled toward the noise. Her movements were jerky, as if the very air was trying to stop her, holding her back with invisible hands. She reached out and gripped the edge of a cold metal object, her fingers wrapping around the knob of the old radio. Her heart pounded louder in her chest as she twisted the dial, desperately searching for the source of the sound. The static buzzed, growing louder and more intense, as if fighting against her, fighting for control. But then, through the thick, crackling noise, a voice emerged. "If you're hearing this, it's already too late." The words were as chilling as the cold air, a dagger to the heart. They didn't sound like a broadcast from a radio station. No, these words felt too direct, too intentional. It was a message, a warning. Maya froze, the world falling away as the voice continued, distorted but clear. "You've made the wrong turn. You've entered the place where time forgets. No one leaves once they arrive. And now, you're one of us." Her breath hitched, a chill running through her veins. A sudden, intense wave of nausea slammed into her, and she staggered back. The words ringing in her ears, reverberating through her skull. The shadows seemed to shift, pulling tighter, wrapping themselves around her like a noose. She was no longer in control of her own body, her limbs sluggish and uncooperative. "Liam," she gasped, spinning in a circle, her heart pounding. She didn't know if he was still here, if he was with her, but she couldn't shake the image of his vacant eyes staring into the abyss. She couldn't shake the thought that he might have already been taken. But then, the radio crackled again, and her attention snapped back to the device. "We've been waiting for you, Maya." Her name, echoed in her mind, chilling her blood. There was no way the voice should know her. She didn't even know how it knew her, how it knew what was happening. But it did. It knew. It had been waiting, watching. The world around her seemed to bend. The radio crackled, the static growing louder, the voice now full of malice. "Your fate is sealed. You're not lost. You're trapped. You will never leave this place. You will wander like all the others forever." The words struck her like lightning, searing her skin, burning the very essence of her soul. The realization crashed over her, a suffocating wave of terror. This place, this highway, this forgotten stretch of road, wasn't just a place. It was a prison. The air shifted. The whispers that had been growing louder, more urgent, finally coalesced into something tangible, something with form and substance. They were no longer distant murmurs, lost in the wind. No, now they were everywhere. A chorus of voices, chanting in unison, repeating over and over again, "It's too late, it's too late, you'll never leave." Maya turned, her legs trembling, every muscle in her body screaming to run, to flee. But the door, the windows, everything was shut tight, sealed with invisible force. She was trapped. Trapped in a place that didn't exist, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The fog, the voices, the shadows, they had all been leading her here, guiding her to this moment. It had always been the plan. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think. Her mind was unraveling, every thread of rationality torn apart by the truth that slammed into her with terrifying force. And then, the last crackling words came. "Welcome to the forgotten highway." The radio went silent, and for the first time, she saw the eyes, hundreds of them, glowing red like embers, watching her from the corners of the room, from the ceiling, from the floor. They were everywhere. Eyes that had been there all along, just waiting for her to notice. But it was too late. Maya's heart hammered in her chest, her mind swirling with panic and confusion. The eyes, those eyes, stared down at her from every shadow, unblinking, unyielding. They seemed to pulse with an unnatural hunger, like 1,000 predatory creatures, locked in a silent, eternal watch. The oppressive weight of the air crushed her lungs, suffocating her with the realization that there was no escape. But then, just as she thought she couldn't take another breath, the atmosphere around her shifted. Something changed. The air, once thick with an eerie stillness, suddenly felt lighter. A shift so subtle she almost didn't catch it, and then she heard it. A soft sound, distant at first but unmistakable, the snap of a twig underfoot, followed by the faint rustling of leaves. Maya's head whipped toward the source, her eyes wide, desperate to make sense of what was happening. Through the cracked windows, beyond the fading light of the station's flickering bulbs, a shape moved in the fog. It was a figure, a shadow, slowly materializing from the haze. As it came into view, Maya's stomach churned. There, standing in the middle of the road, just outside the gas station, was a deer. At first, she thought it was a trick of the fog. The way it stood, motionless, its body outlined by the dim light, made it seem more like a shadow than a real animal. But no, the deer was real, or at least it looked real. Its massive antlers curled upwards like jagged branches twisting toward the heavens, and its coat gleamed in the dim light, pale white with streaks of blood red staining its fur. The deer didn't move. Maya's breath caught. Something about it felt wrong. The silence had become unbearable. The soft wind that had been whipping around the station now stilled, as though the entire world had paused. Everything was still, except for the deer. It didn't blink. It didn't twitch a muscle. It simply stood there, frozen in place, its wide eyes locked on hers. But it wasn't just the stillness that unnerved her. It was the stare. The deer's eyes were wide, too wide, its pupils unnaturally dilated, almost too human for an animal. There was a faint, inexplicable glimmer of something intelligent in those eyes. Not the blank stare of an animal, but something aware, something watching her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take the intense gaze any longer, a soft, almost imperceptible sound began to rise from the air around her. A whisper. The whisper wasn't coming from the deer. It wasn't coming from anywhere that Maya could place. It was the wind itself, soft, slithering, like voices trapped in the earth, breaking free in hushed tones. The whisper seemed to encircle her, curling through her thoughts, brushing against her skin. It was almost too quiet to hear, but it grew louder, clearer, and its message became undeniable. Maya. Her pulse quickened. She stumbled back, eyes wide, heart pounding. She didn't want to turn away, she couldn't, but she had to. Come closer. The whisper was unmistakable now, and the voice was so familiar, so intimate. Maya's throat tightened as she realized that the voice knew her. It wasn't just a random whisper. It was speaking directly to her, calling her by name. But why? And that's when it hit her. The deer's eyes, they were familiar. It's calling me. Before she could finish the thought, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Just slightly, just enough to make her feel as if the very earth had started to shift. The whispering grew louder, more frantic now, as though the voices were multiplying. The deer's stance didn't change, but the air around it seemed to shimmer with an almost electric charge. And then it happened. The deer's lips moved. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but the motion of its jaw was unmistakable. The deer was speaking to her, and in that moment, Maya could hear the words, soft but crystal clear, curling through her mind like a chilling, twisted mantra. Leave the road. Leave the highway. Turn back. Her heart slammed against her chest. The words were a warning. But what was it? Was it the deer? Was it the highway itself speaking through the animal? Maya's eyes locked onto the creature, and it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, its hooves tapping against the pavement, each step sending a wave of dread through her. But the deer wasn't leaving. It was walking toward her. Maya froze. Her feet were heavy, cemented to the ground as the creature inched closer. Its antlers loomed above it like twisted branches, and its eyes, those endless liquid eyes, never left hers. The space between them narrowed, and for a moment it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on her chest. Maya could hear her own breath now, ragged, shallow. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Closer. Come closer. She was shaking, her legs threatening to give way beneath her, but she couldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get away, but her body was paralyzed, trapped in that unblinking gaze. The deer was almost there now, within arm's reach, and that's when she realized the worst thing of all. It wasn't the deer that was walking toward her. It was her. Somehow she was stepping forward, closing the distance, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the thing she feared most. The ground trembled again. A low rumble like thunder shuddered through the earth. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The deer's head tilted slightly to the side, and its lips parted again, revealing sharp, blackened teeth, teeth that shouldn't have been there. And then it whispered once more. It's two. Late to leave. The world tilted, and Maya's stomach lurched as the ground beneath her shifted. She stumbled forward, her body moving with a will of its own. She couldn't stop herself. The whisper was taking over, wrapping itself around her like a chain, pulling her closer to the creature that watched, waited. The last thing she saw before. Everything went black was the deer's glowing eyes. And then, nothing. Maya's mind was a blur. Her body, no longer her own, moved as if compelled by something far beyond her comprehension. The earth beneath her feet seemed to shift and pulse with a strange, unearthly rhythm, and every step she took was weighed down by a terrible, invisible force. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like they were being dragged through thick, viscous fog. And yet she couldn't stop moving. The deer's gaze held her captive. Its eyes, dark and wide, bore into her like two black holes, pulling her in with an insidious magnetic force. The whispers, now like a chorus of voices, curled around her mind, weaving their insidious words into every crevice of her thoughts. It's too late to leave. You belong to the road now. You belong to the highway. Maya tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the silence around her. Her throat tightened, choked by the weight of the air, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on her. She wanted to run. She wanted to flee, to escape this waking nightmare. But her feet moved on their own, each step dragging her closer to the deer, closer to that hollow gaze that now felt like it was peeling her apart, layer by layer. The deer stood unmoving, its presence towering in front of her. It didn't twitch, didn't make a sound, yet the oppressive silence that enveloped them both seemed to carry a weight that Maya could feel deep in her chest. The fog was thickening again, swirling around the creature like an ethereal shroud, blurring the line between what was real and what was not. And then, as if to remind her of its power, the deer's lips parted, revealing teeth, long, jagged, black as coal, sharp like the thorns of some dark forest. The sight sent a violent shudder through Maya's body, but still she couldn't stop. Come closer. The whisper came again, but it wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was in the very air around her, its words fluttering against her skin like the brush of 1,000 invisible fingers. It wasn't a voice. It was an urge, a compulsion. Maya could feel the pressure in her chest intensifying, as if the very essence of the air was pushing her forward, urging her to cross the threshold into some dark, unnamable place. Maya stumbled, her knees buckling under her, but the voice steadied her. It held her up, carried her. Her hands reached out instinctively, brushing against the rough texture of the deer's coat. The fur was cold. colder than ice, colder than anything she had ever felt, closer. She felt her heart skip a beat, the words thick in her ears. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop. Her hands slid down the deer's flank, her fingers brushing over the strange, unnatural patterns in its fur. It felt like the surface of it was shifting beneath her touch, like something was writhing underneath, like it was alive in a way that no animal should be. And then, in a moment of clarity, something inside her snapped. The coldness, the whispers, the presence. It was all too much. She had to break free. She had to stop this. But as she drew back, her body trembling with the force of the realization, the world around her began to distort. The air thickened, and the fog, once swirling in the background, now rushed toward her like a tide. Her vision blurred, and the edges of her reality began to bend. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It rippled like water, as if the entire world was being swallowed by some vast, unseen force. The deer took a slow step forward, its hooves tapping softly on the cracked pavement. The sound echoed, reverberating through the fog. The world trembled in response, and then, just as she thought she could no longer bear the weight of it, the deer opened its mouth again. This time, the voice wasn't a whisper, it was a command. "Come closer, Maya. You're almost there." The words sank deep into her soul. They crawled under her skin, twisting and turning with an undeniable power. The creature was calling her to it, pulling her in, demanding she surrender to it, to the road, to the forgotten highway. Her body obeyed. Maya's legs moved forward again, even though her mind screamed for her to stop. She was no longer in control. Her fingers brushed the deer's fur once more, and this time, as she touched it, she could feel it more distinctly. Something shifting, something underneath the surface. It wasn't just the deer. It wasn't just an animal. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity, but it was too late. The transformation had already begun. The deer's form began to change. It wasn't just the fur, now appearing to writhe and twist as if it were made of shadow, an inky blackness bleeding from beneath its coat. The antlers, once regal, began to curl and twist into grotesque spirals, their points sharp as knives. And then, the deer's body, its body, began to melt, to shift, to form something else entirely. The creature before her wasn't an animal anymore. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been buried within the very land, hidden for centuries. The deer was becoming a twisted, contorted reflection of itself, a mockery of nature's design. It stepped closer, its now human-like fingers reaching out for her. The voice that had once been so soft now boomed in her head, impossibly loud, as if it were speaking through every inch of her mind. "You are one of us now, Maya. You are bound to the road." Her chest constricted, and her breath caught in her throat. The whispers were deafening now, their voices crawling through her skin, filling her lungs, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature's twisted, contorted face, still vaguely the deer's, leaned closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "We've waited for you." The last of Maya's willpower flickered like a dying flame, but before she could resist, before she could escape, the creature's hand, no, its claw, closed around her wrist. The pressure was unbearable. A wave of searing cold rushed through her body, as if the very essence of the highway itself was seeping into her veins, twisting her, reshaping her. And then she understood. It had always been this way. Maya's body felt as if it had been carved out from the inside, hollowed by something ancient and unfathomable. The cold, unnatural touch of the creature's claw gripped her wrist, pulling her forward. Her chest constricted, her breath shallow. And yet the whispers, the voices, had only grown louder, more insistent, urging her to surrender, to join the forgotten highway. Her eyes locked onto the creature's face. The deer's face was long gone, replaced by something darker, something older. The glowing, unnatural eyes had split into many thousands, flickering in and out of existence like stars scattered across a dark, cursed sky. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the faint light. The air around her turned colder, suffocatingly so, and the whispers reverberated through her skull, a discordant choir that blurred into an unintelligible, "You are one of us now, Maya. You belong here. You belong to the road. Forever." And then, just as the words threatened to engulf her, the radio crackled to life once more, piercing the overwhelming silence. The static broke through the air like a thunderclap, raking its sharp fingers over, her mind pulling her back from the abyss, if only for a moment. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears as the familiar voice, the same voice from before, broke through the static, distorted and warped beyond recognition. It was calm, too calm, like it had always been waiting for this moment, this inevitable moment when she would understand. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. The word struck her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her chest. Her knees buckled beneath her, but the creature's grip held firm, anchoring her to the cold, shifting ground beneath her feet. The creature didn't move, its face now a grotesque mask of hunger and satisfaction, its eyes, those glowing, flickering eyes, watching her as though it had seen this moment 1,000 times before. Maya could hardly breathe. The static from the radio pulsed in time with her heartbeat, reverberating in her bones. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, crushing her, and yet her mind couldn't tear itself away from the broadcast. The words, the truth, had already been whispered to her, but now they were becoming clearer. They were meant for her. The voice continued, unhurried, almost soothing in its malice. "You've entered the forgotten highway. There's no escape from here. Not now. Not ever." Her chest tightened. The radio was no longer just a background sound. It was the only sound now, a cold, oppressive hum, drawing her deeper into the madness, weaving her thoughts into its fabric. The creature's claw dug deeper into her wrist, pulling her in, drawing her closer to its writhing, shape-shifting body. It wasn't just the creature. It was the highway itself, the land, the fog, the twisted reality that surrounded them. "We are the keepers of the road, the guardians of this place. You cannot leave." Maya shook her head, trying to break free from the creature's grip, trying to pull herself away from the voice. But it was impossible. Every inch of her being, every muscle, was anchored by the whispers, by the pull of the road. It wasn't physical anymore. The road had entered her mind. The highway had seeped into her very soul. The creature's mouth opened again, but this time no words came. Instead, a series of sickening, twisted images flashed through Maya's mind. Visions, the faces of those who had been here before her, trapped, forgotten. They all stared at her, their eyes hollow and dead, their skin thin and stretched over. Their bones, they had been here, lost to the road just as she was now. "We've waited for you, all of you." Maya gasped as the creature's voice reverberated through her body, vibrating in her chest, flooding her ears. She saw the figures now, not just visions, but real, tangible shadows, drifting in and out of the fog, their hollow eyes locked onto hers. They were watching her too. No one escapes, not once you've entered the highway. The radio's static flickered again, louder, sharper this time, like the breaking of glass. The voice, that same distorted, hollow voice, cut through the chaos, sending shards of terror through her heart. "You will wander this road forever. Time does not exist here." It is a place between worlds, a place where the past and future blur, a place where the lost are kept forever. Her breath hitched. The realization crashed over her with an overwhelming weight, like a flood of cold water that engulfed every inch of her body. The road wasn't just a road, it was alive. The voices, the figures, the creatures, they were all part of it. The highway was a living, breathing entity, and Maya was its newest captive. There would be no escaping it. You belong to us now. You are the new guardian of the road. You will never leave. You will never be free. The voice echoed again, and this time, it wasn't just the radio. The words were in the air, in the very ground beneath her feet. The air trembled as the voice continued, a harsh whisper against her ear. And now, you will be forgotten. Her body jerked, her head spinning, as the ground beneath her feet seemed to crumble away. The fog closed in, swallowing everything in sight. The whispers surged around her, louder now, filling every corner of her mind, drowning out her own thoughts, her own screams. And then, silence. The radio cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but the distant howling of the wind and the suffocating pressure of the forgotten highway. The road stretched endlessly before her, the mile markers blinking, unchanging. The faces of the lost, the countless souls who had wandered here before, flickered in and out of the mist, their hollow eyes locked on hers. Maya could no longer tell if she was walking or floating. The world around her had become a blur, a never-ending loop of fog, of whispers, of eyes watching from the distance. She could feel the weight of eternity pressing down on her, her body growing numb, her mind slipping further away from the reality she once knew. She had been claimed by the highway, and now, like all the others before her, she was forgotten. Maya couldn't tell how long it had been. Time had become an abstract concept, a faraway memory lost in the void of the forgotten highway. She moved mechanically now, her legs carrying her forward without thought, as if some invisible force was guiding her through the endless expanse of fog. The road stretched out before her, but no matter how far she walked, it seemed to curve inward, always leading her back toward the same point, toward the same path she had just left. The trees, no, the shadows, lined the road in every direction, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers, as though trying to pull her back into their dark embrace. The air was thick with something oppressive, something she couldn't name, a weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Each breath she took felt labored, as if the very atmosphere was resisting her, dragging her deeper into the abyss. The mile markers had stopped changing now, frozen in place. The same number, 77, had repeated endlessly, unyielding, a mocking reminder that she was trapped in this place. The road itself had become a prison. The curves of the highway didn't make sense anymore, looping back upon themselves in ways that defied logic. Each corner led to another identical stretch of land, and no matter how far she walked, the fog never lifted. It was like a suffocating blanket, swallowing everything in its path. Maya's head throbbed with an almost unbearable pressure, a dull ache that pulsed with the rhythm of the whispers still haunting her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, always there, lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. It wasn't just the shadows, it was the very road itself. It was alive, shifting, adapting, warping around her as though it had become part of her. She could feel the highway pulling at her, tugging at her very soul, twisting her into its dark fabric. She stumbled, her feet tripping over the uneven pavement, and it was then that she saw it. A figure ahead, standing, just beyond the reach of the headlights. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow that hadn't quite settled in the mist. But as she got closer, it became undeniable. It was her. The figure, tall and indistinct, stood motionless in the middle of the road, shrouded in the same dense fog that enveloped everything else. Its outline was blurry, as if it were both there and not there at the same time, flickering like a reflection in shattered glass. Maya stopped in her tracks, her pulse racing. There was no mistaking it. The figure was her. The shape was just a silhouette, but she could see the curve of the shoulders, the length of the arms, the way the figure stood, with a slow, almost deliberate grace. It was a mirror of herself, but not. It was as though it was her, but it wasn't. There was something wrong about it. Wrong in the way it was still. Maya took a cautious step forward. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she felt her legs pull her toward the figure. It didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, staring into the abyss of the fog, its head slightly tilted, as if it were waiting for her to come closer. Another step. She felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as though she had done this before, as though this moment had already happened 1,000 times over, stretching back into some forgotten time. Each step brought her closer, but she couldn't stop. She was no longer in control. It was as if the highway itself was pulling her in, bending her will to its own. Closer. And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was familiar, but distorted, like a whisper trapped in static, the words jumbled and broken, but still recognizable. Maya. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. The voice, it was her voice, but not quite. It was too distant, too fragmented, as if it had been pulled apart and reconstructed in 1,000 different ways, each one a little off, a little twisted. You've been here before. You know this road. It's always been you. Maya's heart stuttered in her chest. The words burrowed deep inside her, tugging at the fragments of her fading memories, pulling them into focus. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands scraping against the pavement as she tried to steady herself. You've always been part of the road, part of the highway, forever. Just like me. The figure raised one arm slowly, as though in greeting, and the motion was so eerily familiar that it made Maya's stomach churn. It was as if the figure, the other her, was inviting her to join, to become one with the road. A flood of images flashed in her mind, images of people who had come before her, trapped in the same eternal loop, their faces twisted in terror, as they wandered the endless stretch of highway, never aging, never escaping. The figure's eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly through the fog, reflecting the same eerie, blood-red light she had seen in the shadows before. Maya, Maya. The whispers continued, like a chant, a lullaby that carried the weight of 1,000 lost souls. And then, just as she thought she could no longer bear it, the figure stepped forward, its feet moving silently through the fog, closing the distance between them. Its face, a reflection of her own, was now fully visible, and as she stared into the empty, hollow eyes of the creature before her, Maya realized the horrifying truth. The figure was her. It was a reflection of everything she had lost, everything she had become. She had been swallowed by the road. She had become a part of the highway, a guardian, a lost soul doomed to wander these endless curves forever. The highway had claimed her, and now it was ready to claim another. We are the highway. You will never leave. With the final whisper, the figure reached out and touched her arm, its hand cold and lifeless. The world tilted, the road spiraling inward once again. The fog closed in, and the last shred of Maya's willpower was consumed by the endless, suffocating grip of the forgotten highway. Maya felt her body shift, twisting, stretching, like she was being pulled through a thin veil between worlds. The figure that had been her reflection no longer stood before her. Instead, the road seemed to expand in every direction, its curvature stretching outward into an infinite, unbroken loop. Her mind reeled, trying desperately to comprehend the chaos around her, but nothing made sense anymore. There were no boundaries, no edges, just fog and road and the endless hum of whispers that seemed to merge into one entity. And then, through the haze, something caught her eye. A dark shape, an old rusted car, sat abandoned on the side of the road. Its once gleaming paint was now chipped and faded, the windows cracked and the tires deflated. The car was like an old, forgotten relic, left to rot at the edge of time, surrounded by the suffocating fog that seemed to seep into every crack and crevice of the vehicle. Maya's heart skipped a beat. A sudden, strange compulsion urged her forward. She didn't want to go near it. She didn't want to investigate, but something in the back of her mind pushed her toward the vehicle, something primal, like a voice she couldn't ignore. Her legs moved before her mind could protest, bringing her closer to the abandoned car. Each step felt heavier, as if the very road was weighing her down, dragging her closer to the inevitable truth. She could feel the cold air biting into her skin, could feel the whispering voices fluttering in her ears like moths, their fragmented words mixing with the steady pounding of her heart. The car sat there waiting for her, almost expectantly. She reached the door and hesitated. The handle was covered in rust, the metal giving a dull squeak as she touched it. The air around the car smelled of damp earth, of rot, sickly sweet, like something long forgotten. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but her fingers curled around the handle, turning it with a force that didn't feel like her own. The door creaked open. Inside, the car was empty, but not in the way she expected. There were no remnants of belongings, no traces of a past passenger, nothing that would indicate the vehicle had been used recently. The seats, cracked and worn, seemed to sag under the weight of time, as though the car had been abandoned for decades. Yet, something about it felt alive, like it was still waiting, still hoping for someone to come and sit in its decaying embrace. Maya's eyes scanned the interior, looking for anything out of place. Her fingers brushed the dust-covered dashboard, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of movement, a flicker in the rearview mirror, something shifting behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just more fog, just the suffocating silence. Her pulse quickened, but it wasn't fear. It was familiarity. Something inside her recognized this car, this place, in a way she couldn't explain. The unease grew stronger, a cold sense of dread creeping up her spine as she stepped back, suddenly desperate to leave. But the road, the fog, it was still there. The same looping stretch of highway, the same endless repetition of mile marker, E7. She felt trapped again, suffocated, like the very air was holding her hostage. And then, from somewhere behind her, a faint sound, the screech of tires on gravel. Maya spun around, her eyes wide with fear. But the car hadn't moved. The engine wasn't running. No one had come. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Someone was coming. Someone was approaching. But from where? Her heart thudded in her chest, and she felt the sharp sting of panic clawing at her insides. She glanced back at the abandoned car, its vacant, lifeless interior offering no answers, and suddenly felt wrong. There was something about this place that tugged at her mind, some unseen connection she couldn't quite grasp. She had seen this car before. No, she had. But the car wasn't hers. The car wasn't Liam's. The realization hit her like a wave. She had seen the car in her own reflection. She had seen it in the twisted face of the figure that had beckoned her, the reflection that was now a part of the road, a part of the highway itself. This was where they all ended up. This was where everyone who walked this path wound up. The abandoned car was the symbol, the final resting place, the inevitable conclusion. She had seen the other, faces the lost, The twisted, hollow eyes that once had names, once had identities, before the highway had consumed them. Those who wandered the endless road, trapped in the same cycle, just like her. And now, the car was waiting for her too, waiting for her to sit inside, to join the ranks of the forgotten. Suddenly, there was a shift. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, rising from the very ground beneath her. It was no longer the faint whispers that haunted her mind, but a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. Come back, you'll be one of us. Come back, and the road will stop, the cycle will end. But she knew better now. The road didn't stop, it didn't end. The highway was eternal. The voices weren't offering peace. They were pulling her back into the endless loop. She was already becoming one of them. She turned away from the car, her feet dragging, her mind spiraling as the fog seemed to thicken around her, suffocating her senses. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but there was nowhere to go. The car, the road, it all stretched before her, as endless as time itself. And no matter how far she walked, no matter how hard she fought, she knew she would always return here, to the place where it all began. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for something, anything, that could break the cycle. But there was only the fog, the road, the looming presence of the highway that had already claimed her. And as she stood there, the first rays of dawn began to break through the fog, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. But it didn't feel like morning. The light was false, cold, like the world was simply resetting, starting again, as if the cycle was about to repeat itself. Her feet began to move again, and, in the distance, the sound of screeching tires grew louder. The road stretched endlessly before her, an unbroken ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the thickening fog. The very air felt different now, heavy, oppressive, suffused with a feeling of foreboding that clung to Maya like a second skin. Every step she took was a battle, her feet dragging with an unnatural weight, as though the highway itself were pulling her forward, urging her to continue down this path, no matter how much she fought to resist. The sound of the screeching tires had grown louder, but it wasn't approaching. No, it was moving away from her, fading into the distance, leaving only the disorienting hum of the road. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the car was still out there, somewhere, waiting for her to return to it, to climb inside and become a part of the cycle. She turned her head back toward the abandoned vehicle, now barely visible in the fog. But it was gone. The place where it had once been was empty, the road stretching uninterrupted, devoid of any sign that it had ever been there. Had she imagined it? No, she hadn't. It had been real. The car had been real, and it was part of this place, this road, the highway that twisted and contorted with a mind of its own, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Maya's mind was unraveling, and the fear that gnawed at her grew sharper, more insistent. Her pulse quickened as the fog seemed to press in on her, closer now, as if it was alive, suffocating her with its insidious presence. She needed to keep moving, needed to get away. But where was she supposed to go? She turned again, desperate to find any sign of life, any escape from the oppressive, suffocating silence. But there was nothing. The road was a loop, a never-ending path that twisted in on itself, folding into an impossible horizon. No matter how far she walked, it all led back to the same place, the same stretch of land where the road disappeared into the fog, where time had no meaning. A sudden sound, low and ominous, rattled through the stillness. The faintest tremor in the ground, a vibration so subtle it might have been imagined, ran through her legs, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath her. Maya's heart raced as the sensation of movement underfoot intensified. The road, the ground, the very air around her, all of it seemed to tremble as though something was awakening, something beneath the road, something ancient and hungry. She froze. Ahead of her, the horizon seemed to warp, bending in unnatural ways like a distortion in reality itself. The road didn't curve this way. The fog didn't move like that. Maya stepped forward cautiously as her eyes strained to make sense of the sight before her. The asphalt stretched out, but instead of the usual monotonous stretch of pavement, the road began to twist upward, spiraling in on itself like a funnel, pulling the land toward some unseen point. The sky above her had darkened, though she couldn't tell when it had happened. It was as if the very concept of day and night had no place here. The fog swirled, thickening, and within it, something moved. A shadow. A shape. It was too large to be a person, too formless to make out. And then, with terrifying clarity, the road vanished. Gone. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The fog cleared, not in the direction she'd been walking, but to her right. And there it was, just beyond the haze, an open space. A vast, yawning chasm where the road should have been, a black void that stretched endlessly, far beyond what her eyes could comprehend. The road, her road, had disappeared into nothingness. There was no sign of where it had gone, no explanation for the massive emptiness that now stood before her. The twisting, bending asphalt had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only a hollow, vacant space, as if the highway had been swallowed by the earth. For a moment, there was nothing. A cold silence stretched around her, a suffocating absence that echoed in the pit of her stomach. Then, from the depths of the chasm, something stirred. A sound like a faint scraping against stone, dragging itself through the dark. It grew louder, and Maya realized with sudden horror that it wasn't just the sound of something coming closer. It was the sound of the road returning. The road, her road, was coming back. She could feel it beneath her feet. A tremor rippled through the ground as the fog receded, and the dark, formless shape at the edge of the chasm began to take shape. The pavement, black, slick, and newly laid, seemed to emerge from the void, creeping forward like an extension of the very land itself. The road was reforming, reconstructing itself, and as it grew, it began to curve, just as it always had, toward her. Maya took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to move, she had to run. But the road was already there, stretching outward, pulling her back into its fold. Her feet felt as if they were rooted to the ground, her legs refusing to obey her commands. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing. The fog had disappeared, leaving behind only the thick, oppressive silence and the now closed chasm. She didn't want to go back. She couldn't. But the road was a force beyond her control. The whispers had started again, rising from the very ground beneath her, louder now, more insistent. The highway wanted her. It was calling her. It was bringing her back to the place where it all began. Come back, Maya. Her chest tightened with dread as the new stretch of road loomed before her, the end of the journey just beyond reach. And with every step she took toward the newly formed path, the whispers grew stronger, louder, as if they were feeding off her fear, pulling her toward the inevitable. There was no turning back now. She had entered the highway, and the highway had claimed her. She was stuck, and as the road twisted back on itself, the last mile marker appeared, just ahead, mile 77. The road was a living thing now, pulsating beneath Maya's feet, pulling her forward with a magnetic force that no willpower could resist. The fog had thickened once again, obscuring the edges of the world around her. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, suffocating her, as the whispers wrapped tighter around her mind. They were no longer distant murmurs, but sharp, jagged voices that screamed for her attention, each one rising over the last in a cacophony of urgency. Come closer, you must come closer. The sound was deafening. The words echoed in every part of her body, vibrating in her bones, drowning out any thought, any hope of escape. Maya's feet dragged, her every step a battle against an invisible force that pulled her deeper into the highway's grasp. Her legs burned, her muscles ached, but still, she was compelled to move forward. She couldn't fight it anymore. She didn't know how long she had been walking. Minutes, hours, days. Time had become irrelevant. The road was endless. It twisted, spiraled, stretched into infinity, pulling her along like a puppet on a string. The sky above her was no longer just dark. It was a blackness that swallowed light. The clouds seemed to hang lower now, thick and oppressive, as if they were pressing in on her, suffocating her, threatening to crush her under their weight. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping at an alarming rate, until her breath turned to vapor, freezing in the air before her. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, but it was wrong, like she wasn't walking on Earth anymore. And then, the whispering stopped. It was abrupt, jarring. The silence that followed was more deafening than the whispers themselves. It was a suffocating, oppressive stillness, like the entire world had come to a grinding halt. Maya stopped, her body trembling as she strained to hear something, anything. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and the world around her seemed to press in, pressing on her very soul. Her breath quickened, her chest rising and falling with each panicked gasp. She was so alone, so utterly alone. The fog swirled in every direction, thick and impenetrable. The road stretched endlessly before her, but there was nothing at its end. There was no light, no horizon, just an endless, yawning blackness. And then, a sound. The sound of a door creaking open. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The door's screech was agonizing, like a tortured animal crying out for release. The sound was coming from behind her, somewhere in the fog, but Maya didn't dare turn. The darkness in front of her was more inviting than the shadow that had begun to stir behind her. The door was a call. She knew that. It was pulling her in, forcing her to acknowledge it. Another creak, louder this time. The door was open now, and with it, something else stepped through. Maya spun around, but there was nothing at first, just more fog. The world was now too still. It was as though time itself had frozen, holding its breath, waiting for her to acknowledge the thing that was coming. She could feel it, its presence, lurking in the fog. And then, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself, it emerged. A figure. It wasn't fully formed, not entirely human. It was more like a shadow, an ink blot against the fog. But there was something deeply wrong about it. The edges of its form wavered, constantly shifting, as though it could not quite hold a solid shape. And yet there was no mistaking it. It was moving toward her. The figure was tall, too tall, its limbs too long, stretched in unnatural angles that made it seem like it didn't belong in this world. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a void. Nothing but a black, empty space where eyes should have been. But somehow, Maya could feel the gaze, that hollow stare that pushed at her, pulling her in, drowning her in its emptiness. The air grew colder still, biting into her skin like 1,000 needles. The figure was closer now, its movements slow and deliberate, each step sending a ripple of fear through Maya's body. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't anything she could recognize. It was the sound of the road itself. You cannot leave. Not now, not ever. Maya's heart stopped. Her legs gave way beneath her, but she caught herself on the road, her hands scraping against the cold asphalt. The words, the voice, raked across her mind like claws, digging deep into the very essence of her being. She felt the weight of the truth settling over her. The road had claimed her. The highway had swallowed her whole, and there was no escape. The darkness around her seemed to press in, suffocating her. The figure, no, the presence, was standing just beyond her reach now, towering over her, its shape flickering in and out of existence like a dying flame. Its voice reached her again, softer now, like a whispered lullaby that filled her mind with dread. This is your home now. You will wander, forever, lost, forgotten. The words wrapped around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. Maya tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to run, to flee from the figure, but the road was pulling her back. The fog was closing in, thickening, swallowing everything around her. And then, just as she thought she would be lost forever, something else happened. The road itself, the highway, seemed to tremble, a low hum reverberating beneath her feet. The fog parted, but not to reveal the endless road. No, it parted to reveal a different scene altogether, the familiar mile marker. Mile 77. It wasn't just there, it was there, standing in front of her, bright and flashing like a neon sign. The numbers blinked, repeating over and over, and then slowly, the figure moved forward, its form warping, distorting into 1,000 shifting images, each one more horrific than the last. "This is where you belong," it whispered, and Maya understood. There was no escape. Maya's mind was a battlefield, her thoughts a chaotic blur of fear, confusion, and a terrible sense of inevitability. The highway had become her prison. The figure, whatever it was, whatever it had been, had spoken the truth, its words sinking into her mind with a weight that was impossible to ignore. This is where you belong. Her heart was still racing, her chest tight with panic. But every part of her, her body, her mind, her soul, was caught in the same loop. The road stretched before her, unending, infinite, like a thread that had no beginning and no end. The fog had parted again, but instead of revealing something new, something real, it only brought her back to the same place. The same stretch of road, the same mile markers, the same stretching emptiness. It was as if the highway itself had been waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to realize that there was no exit, no way out. No matter how far she walked, no matter how many turns she took, she would always return to this spot, always end up at the same place. The figures from the fog, the whispers that filled her mind. They had all been part of the cycle. And now she was too. Her legs were shaking, but still she couldn't stop walking. Her feet moved of their own accord, dragging her forward as if they were on a leash, tied to the very road itself. She could feel the pull, the compulsion, as though the highway had wrapped its tendrils around her soul and was slowly dragging her down into the darkness. Maya's eyes locked onto the mile marker as it flickered before her, its numbers glowing faintly in the mist. 77. It had always been 77. No matter how far she walked, no matter how many hours, days, or years she had spent on this endless stretch of road, it always brought her back here. This was the starting point, the middle, and the end of everything. This is where you belong. The voice whispered again, the same hollow, distorted tone she had heard before, as if it were coming from the very pavement beneath her feet. The road had no mercy. The highway had no end. It was a place outside of time, a place where the lost were trapped, where the endless cycle of wandering was the only reality. The whispers grew louder again, but this time, Maya didn't fight them. There was no point. She was tired. So tired. Her mind felt like it was slipping away, her thoughts becoming more disjointed, more fractured, with each passing moment. She could feel her body growing colder, her skin tingling with the strange, unnatural chill that had settled over the land. The air felt thick, oppressive, pressing down on her chest as though the fog itself were alive, a suffocating, invisible force wrapping around her. Her feet carried her forward, and she couldn't remember how long she had been walking anymore. Had it been days, hours, or had it been centuries? Was this even real? "You'll never leave," the voice said again. "We've been waiting for you. You are one of us now, forever." The words pierced through her like 1,000 sharp knives, and for a moment she thought she would fall, thought the weight of them would crush her completely. But she didn't fall. She kept walking. She had no choice. She couldn't stop. And then something shifted in the distance. Something strange and wrong. The road, which had been endless, twisting in its unyielding loop, bent. It curved sharply in a direction it had never taken before, breaking the cycle. Maya's heart stuttered in her chest, and for the first time she thought she saw an opening, a break in the endless fog. It was faint, just a glimmer of light, just a sliver of possibility. Her eyes widened with sudden, desperate hope. She could feel it, a sliver of escape, a chance to break free from the cycle, from the whispers. She didn't know how or why, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw a way out. She broke into a run, her breath ragged as she pounded down the road, the distant light pulling her forward. The wind whipped around her, colder than before, colder than anything she had ever felt, but she didn't care. The light ahead grew, brighter, more tangible. She could see it now, like a distant star, like the glimmer of hope she had so desperately been searching for. She was almost there, almost free. But just as she reached the end of the road, the place where the light should have been, where the escape should have been waiting for her, the fog closed in. The light vanished. The road stopped. She stumbled to a halt, her breath caught in her throat as the fog pressed in from all sides. She blinked, desperate to see what had just happened, but the road had disappeared. No, she had fallen into the same trap. The path had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. There was nothing ahead of her, just the endless, never-ending stretch of the highway and the mile marker. 77. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the reality of what had just happened slammed into her. The road had shifted, had changed, but it had only done so to trap her again. It was as if the highway itself was playing with her, teasing her with the hope of escape before pulling it away at the last moment. Maya collapsed to her knees, the cold pavement pressing against her skin. She couldn't move. Her body wouldn't listen. Her mind was fragmented, lost in the constant loop, but she couldn't escape. "You'll never leave," the voice whispered again. And this time, it didn't feel like the road. It didn't feel like the figure. It felt like her own voice. She had become part of the highway, and now she was lost. The miles stretched out before her, forever. And mile 77 blinked unchanging, as if it had been there all along. The air was thick with silence, suffocating in its stillness. Maya's chest tightened, her breath shallow and ragged as she stared at the unchanging mile marker. 77, the same number, the same road, the same twisted, endless path she had walked 1,000 times. There was no escape, no freedom. The whispers had faded, but they still lingered in the back of her mind, an insistent hum, a low, oppressive pressure that threatened to crack her apart. She could feel it now, deep in her bones. The certainty that the road was not just a place, but a sentience, something ancient and unknowable, watching her, feeding off her fear. She had become part of it. The highway had claimed her, just as it had claimed everyone before her. The endless cycle would continue, and she was now bound to it, lost in the labyrinth of roads that stretched into infinity. Her legs were stiff, her body aching with exhaustion, but she could no longer move. She had no strength left, no will to keep going. The fog closed in tighter around her, and the darkness of the road felt like a weight, a weight that was pressing her down, suffocating her thoughts, her very existence. There was no way out, no way forward, no way back. She had become one with the forgotten highway, and then, through the crushing silence, she heard it, the faintest crackle, the unmistakable hum of static. She blinked, her head snapping up, her heart leaping in her chest. The sound had come from nowhere, from the very air around her. It was the same static that had haunted her for what felt like an eternity. The radio, that cursed, distorted voice that had followed her, taunted her, and now it was back. Maya's eyes scanned the fog, but there was nothing. No sign of a radio, no device in sight, just the endless stretch of road and the cold, oppressive silence that filled the space between the static. The voice came through the static once more, clearer now, but still distorted, as if it were being transmitted from somewhere far, far away. The tone was cold, detached, but there was something familiar about it. It was the same voice she had heard before, the voice of the road. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. The words hit her like a blow. Her heart skipped a beat. She felt her body tense, every muscle frozen in place. The voice, the same one she had heard countless times, now seemed more real than ever, more present. It was no longer a distant whisper. It was all around her, filling her mind with its cold certainty. You've crossed the threshold, Maya. You've entered the place where time doesn't matter, where the road is all that exists. You will never leave. You are part of the highway now, forever. Her head spun, her thoughts fragmenting. The road had always been her prison, but now it was her eternity. She had crossed into a place where there was no escape, no end. The road would go on, endless, stretching into the blackness, and she would walk it for all eternity, a part of its endless cyclical torment. She sank to her knees, her mind unraveling. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't scream. She could barely breathe, and yet the voice continued, its words like ice shattering her sanity. You are not lost. You are home. This is where you belong. This is where you will stay. Maya closed her eyes, the pressure in her chest growing unbearable. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, she wanted to escape. But there was no escape. There was only the highway. Only mile 77, glowing faintly in the distance, beckoning her forward into the nothingness. The static continued, crackling through the air like an electric storm. The voice was softer now, quieter, but it still pierced through her thoughts, a constant reminder of what she had become. You've always been here, Maya. You just didn't know it yet. The highway has always been your path. And now, you are its guardian. You are part of the road, just like all the others before you. The truth settled into her mind like a cold stone, heavy and immovable. She was not lost, not anymore. She had been chosen by the road, and now she was part of its eternal cycle. The fog, the whispers, the endless pavement. It had all been waiting for her. And now she would wander it, just like the others who had come before her, forever bound to the highway. Her eyes opened slowly, her gaze fixed on the mile marker. 77. It had always been 77. And then the final words came, slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of an eternity. Welcome back, Maya. The world shifted, the road before her warping as the fog closed in around her. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling her ears with the names of the lost, the forgotten. And as the darkness pressed in, Maya realized that she had become one of them. She was no longer a traveler. She was part of the road, a guardian of the highway, destined to wander the endless stretch of pavement, never to find rest, never to escape. The road had claimed her, and now, like all the others before her, she was forgotten. The fog closed in, and the mile 77 marker flickered one last time, and then nothing. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The city of Seattle, shrouded in mist and heavy rain, whispered secrets beneath its towering skyline. The businessman, tired from a long flight, stepped into the gleaming lobby of a luxury hotel. He hadn't expected to be so weary. The kind of exhaustion that clung to the bones, seeping into his muscles. He'd been traveling for hours, caught in a whirlwind of meetings and delayed flights. All he wanted was a warm bed, a brief respite, before the next day demanded his attention. The receptionist, a young woman with 2 bright eyes, greeted him with an odd familiarity. She handed him a small silver key. "Room 813, she said, her voice clipped but polite. There was something almost mechanical about her smile, as though it were a rehearsed gesture rather than an expression of true welcome. "Thank you," he muttered, distracted by the fatigue creeping up on him. He barely noticed the small pause before she turned away, as though waiting for something else to happen. But he didn't think much of it. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and he stepped. Inside, the metallic scent of the enclosed space mingling with the faint aroma of freshly cut flowers from the lobby. As the elevator rose, his reflection in the mirrored walls seemed distant, almost hollow, as though someone else were looking back at him, someone who had already left the building long ago. The doors opened to the 8th floor with an almost inaudible click. He stepped out, the hallway stretching before him, lined with identical doors, each one polished to perfection. But as he walked down the corridor, something felt wrong. The floor beneath his feet seemed slightly too firm, the air too still, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He reached room 8113. The door was silent, no squeak of hinges or sound of life within. The room number was clear, crisp, on a small brass plaque. It seemed entirely ordinary, almost too ordinary for a hotel with so much grandeur. He slid the key into the lock, the click echoing in the stillness. As he stepped inside, a cool draft swept through him, as if the room had been waiting for him. The room itself was immaculate, like something out of a catalogue. The bed was made with sharp, crisp lines. The curtains were drawn shut, and the pale city light filtered weakly through the cracks. He tossed his suitcase on the bed, and for the first time in what felt like days, allowed himself to exhale. He stretched, looking out the window at the city lights below, but his thoughts began to blur, fatigue taking over. It wasn't long before the weight of sleep came crashing down on him, but as his eyes closed, a chill danced along his spine, like fingers trailing softly along his neck. The room held its breath. Something else was waiting for him. Something more than just sleep. The weight of sleep wasn't kind. It pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, but it was a relief all the same. The businessman's eyes fluttered shut, drawn into the black void of unconsciousness. Yet just before sleep fully claimed him, a strange sensation lingered in the corners of his mind, a fluttering, like a moth too close to the flame. He shook it off, convinced it was just the exhaustion. The room seemed to sigh, and then everything was still. Time passed. An hour, maybe 2. The businessman slept soundly, unaware of the shadows that curled just beyond the reach of his vision. There was no clock in the room, but he didn't need one. He'd been traveling far too long, and his body had the peculiar ability to tell him when enough rest had been had. He awoke to the soft hum of the city, the distant roar of traffic mingling with the faint sound of rain hitting the window. For a moment he didn't move. His mind was still thick with dreams, his body reluctant to leave the warmth of the bed. The sheets clung to his skin like they had been holding him too long, but something in the room had shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A draft, far colder than it should have been, brushed across his face, and he shivered, pulling the covers tighter around his shoulders. The room felt larger now somehow. It wasn't that the dimensions had changed, but the air had thickened, as if the very walls had drawn closer, constricting. The sound of the rain outside was muffled, as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet meeting the cool floor with a quiet thud. His head was heavy, disoriented, and he felt a strange unease creeping up his spine. Something about this hotel was beginning to feel wrong. He walked toward the window, his footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. Through the glass, the city spread out beneath him, its lights twinkling like stars in a vast distant sky. But something was missing from the view, something he couldn't quite place. The street below seemed quieter than it should have been. Too still. The usual bustle of Seattle, the noise of a busy metropolis, had vanished, leaving only a silence that felt unnatural. His fingers hovered over the curtains, hesitant. He had never been one to believe in omens or superstitions, but the air in this room felt oppressive, like the weight of something unseen was pressing down on him. With a swift motion, he yanked the curtains aside, expecting to find the lively streets and the hum of urban life. But what he saw made his heart stop. The street was gone. There was no city below him, no skyline stretching out in the distance, just blackness, a void so deep and endless that his mind refused to accept it. The window framed only an empty abyss, an unnatural dark that seemed to stretch on forever. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. His breath caught in his throat. Impossible. There had to be an explanation, a simple one, like faulty glass or a trick of the light. But as he stared, he felt it, a presence behind him, cold and heavy, as if the room itself was no longer empty. He slowly turned. His reflection in the mirror across the room seemed to blink back at him. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. His reflection was off. His movements were delayed, like an afterthought. His hand, still holding the curtain, remained suspended in the air even as his reflection mimicked him, but with a disturbing lag. And then, the reflection did something he didn't. It smiled. A smile too wide, too unnatural. His heart raced as his reflection grinned, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. The real him stood frozen, unable to look away. The smile in the mirror slowly faded, and just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The reflection returned to normal, and he stood there shaking. No, this couldn't be real. He must have been dreaming again. The exhaustion was getting to him. It had to be. He turned away from the mirror and walked toward the door, his mind racing. Maybe he should call the front desk. Maybe he was just overtired, hallucinating. But before he could reach the door, the phone on the nightstand rang. Taz was the same unsettling ring that echoed in the silence of the room. And it was too early, too abrupt. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, the receiver cold against his ear. Room 8113, a low voice whispered, one that didn't sound human at all. You shouldn't have come. The line went dead before he could even respond, leaving only the static buzz in his ear and the oppressive silence that swallowed the room whole. A sharp knock at the door. It was a firm knock. Not soft, but a demanding one. He turned toward the door. Who would be here at this hour? His fingers gripped the doorknob, his heart thudding in his chest. This had to be a mistake. There was nothing wrong with the room, with the hotel. He opened the door and froze. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the dim hallway, was the hotel manager. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with an unsettling confusion. She didn't speak right away, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with some hidden truth she hadn't yet accepted. "Sir," her voice trembled as she stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly against the floor, too crisp and calculated. "We don't have a room 813. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. For a moment everything seemed to freeze. The hallway, the hum of the hotel, the very breath in his lungs. His mind raced, and his eyes flickered to the doorframe, then to the small brass plaque beside him. It said, 813, plain as day. His stomach churned, nausea twisting in his gut. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice sounding foreign in the silence. He hadn't meant for it to sound so defensive, but there was something about the look on her face that sent a ripple of unease through him. She looked back at the door with disbelief, then down the hallway, as if expecting someone, something. "There's no 813, it's not possible." She stepped back, glancing nervously at the empty hallway, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I must be mistaken, but please," she whispered, voice trembling now. "You need to leave this room." The businessman's heart quickened, confusion swirling in his mind. Was this some kind of mistake, some odd hotel glitch? "I've been in this room all night. I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firming, even as his stomach twisted, with unease. He looked over her shoulder at the hallway, quiet, too quiet, and the lights flickered overhead in a strange, almost rhythmic pattern. The manager's gaze flickered nervously to the end of the hall again, her fingers clutching at her blouse. She seemed to be holding herself together by sheer force of will, her movements stilted and unnatural. "You don't understand," she whispered, glancing back at him. "It's not your fault, but it's not your room. It never was." Before he could respond, the manager pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. She dialed something hastily, but the line went dead almost immediately. The screen flickered and went black, as if something invisible had snuffed it out. She stared at the phone in disbelief. I need to make a call. Stay right here." The manager turned and rushed down the hall, leaving the businessman standing in the doorway, his breath catching in his chest. But something felt wrong, more wrong than before. The manager's hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, but they seemed faint, as if they were getting farther and farther away. The hallway stretched out before him, far longer than it had when he first arrived. A strange pressure built in the air, suffocating him, making it hard to breathe. He stepped back inside the room, unsure of what to do. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing him inside. Suddenly, there was a loud buzz, the phone on the nightstand alive once more. He hesitated for a moment, dread creeping up his spine, but finally he picked it up. The voice on the other end was soft, almost too soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. "We know you're awake," it hissed, its tone familiar, as if it had been waiting for him all along. "You can't leave. It's too late for that. They'll never let you." His pulse raced. "What? Who is this?" he demanded, but there was no reply, only the faint rustling of breath, the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes crawling over him. He dropped the phone back onto the nightstand, heart pounding, a cold sweat forming on his forehead. What was happening? This was insane. The hotel, the manager, the phone, none of it made sense. A knock. This time it wasn't soft. It was insistent, demanding. The heavy sound reverberated through the door, making the businessman's stomach churn. He froze, unable to move for a moment, his body paralyzed by the tension in the air. "Who is it?" he managed to croak, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. No one responded. The knocking came again, louder, sharper this time, as if someone or something was eager to get inside. His heart thudded in his chest. The room, suddenly too small, the walls closing in. He tried to tell himself it was just another hotel mix-up, some trick of the mind or a prank. But when he opened the door, he wasn't greeted by the hotel manager. The hallway was gone. The businessman stood frozen in the doorway, heart hammering in his chest. The hallway, where the hotel manager had just been, where the soft hum of the building should have been, was gone. Instead, he stared into an abyss. The familiar carpet of the corridor had vanished, replaced by an endless, dark void. The faint flickering lights that once lined the hallway were now gone, leaving only a vast, infinite blackness stretching beyond what his eyes could comprehend. The shadows curled unnaturally around the edges, as though they were waiting for him to step into them. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, so thick it felt as though the very essence of the hotel had been erased, leaving nothing but this gaping, suffocating space. He stepped out of the room, instinct screaming at him to retreat, to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the gravity itself had changed, pulling him closer to the abyss. His breathing grew shallow as he looked desperately to his left, then to his right. There was no sign of the manager, no sign of anyone, just the vast emptiness of the hallway, stretching forever in both directions. "Hello?" His voice echoed, back at him in the stillness, but it didn't sound like his own. It sounded distorted, like someone else was speaking in the shadows, mimicking him. His words bounced off the void and scattered, disintegrating into the dark. He stepped backward, his footfalls too loud now, disturbing the eerie stillness of the space. He felt the urge to close the door behind him, to shut out the horror unfolding before him. But as his hand gripped the handle, something made him stop. His reflection in the mirror, mounted on the opposite wall, caught his eye. He froze. At first, it was just his own face, pale and confused, staring back at him with wide eyes. But then slowly, the reflection shifted. The version of him in the mirror smiled. A slow, unsettling grin that was not his own. It was wrong, too wide, too sinister. His own image seemed to distort, the corners of his mouth stretching in an unnatural curve, as though it had been touched by something that wasn't human. It was the same smile he had seen earlier, the one that had crept up on him in his dreamlike stupor. The smile that was not his own but felt all too familiar. His breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. But the reflection didn't stop. It began to change. The eyes of the reflection turned dark, hollow, empty pits where the light once lived. The air around the mirror grew colder, and his reflection seemed to flicker, the lines between it and the hallway warping as though the glass were not a barrier but an opening, an invitation into something far worse. Suddenly, the smile vanished. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, mirroring his own movement, but its eyes remained empty and lifeless. The reflection leaned in close to the glass, its dark pupils staring directly into his soul. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered. But there were no words, only a cold breath that seemed to crawl into his chest, suffocating him. "Leave now." His pulse quickened. He staggered backward, away from the mirror, away from the thing staring back at him. The reality of what was happening crashed down on him all at once, a flood of terror that left him dizzy and lightheaded. The room around him seemed to pulse, the walls tightening as though they were alive, closing in around him. He turned to leave, his feet stumbling over each other. But when he looked at the door, his heart stopped. The door he had just opened was no longer there. The room, his room, had vanished, replaced with an endless, yawning hallway that stretched infinitely into the darkness. There was no sign of the room's familiar bed, the curtains, the nightstand, nothing. It was as if it had never existed at all. Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. He reached out, his fingers touching the cold, smooth surface of the walls, feeling for the door, feeling for something familiar. But the hallway seemed to be shifting, its boundaries warping with every desperate touch. His breath came in ragged gasps. It was as if the hotel itself was swallowing him whole, erasing every trace of his existence. He turned back to face the hallway, the vast, endless stretch of nothingness that awaited him, and tried to call out again. "Help, is anyone there?" But this time his voice didn't echo. Instead, it was swallowed up by the void, fading into a chilling silence. The air grew colder, heavier. The faintest whisper of something, not a human voice, but something older, deeper, slithered into his ears. "You were never here." The words froze him to the core. He couldn't move. The floor beneath him felt unstable, shifting, as if it were no longer solid. He had to get out. He had to leave. But how could he? Where could he go? The hallway around him seemed to shift again, stretching and contorting, as though it were alive, mocking his every move. "Leave now," the voice repeated, its tone soothing yet suffocating. And then he heard it, the soft click of footsteps, small, deliberate, the manager. She was back. He turned to find her standing at the far end of the hall, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. "You should have left," she whispered, barely audible over the growing hum in his ears. But before he could speak, the hallway shifted again, and she was gone. The businessman stood in the middle of the void, his legs shaking beneath him as the last remnants of the hotel's comforting reality vanished. The hallway had expanded, deepened, stretched further than any hallway should. It no longer resembled anything familiar. No carpeting, no flickering lights, no signs of life or movement, only shadows. Endless, oppressive shadows. The air tasted wrong. It was thick, dense with something that clung to the back of his throat, like the taste of damp earth after a storm. Every breath he took seemed to drag the heavy, stagnant air deeper into his lungs, choking him slowly, methodically. His heart pounded in his chest, desperate to escape this nightmare, but his limbs felt like lead, too heavy to move, too sluggish to fight. The walls were no longer solid. They undulated, rippling like water disturbed by something unseen beneath the surface. With each breath, each hesitant step forward, the space seemed to stretch and warp, moving further and further away from him, as if the hallway itself was alive, pulling him deeper into its dark embrace. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a subtle tremor that seemed to come from all around him. It felt like a pulse, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. And then, as if in response to his mounting panic, the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was a rhythmic drumming in his ears, drowning out every other noise, every other thought. He tried to focus, to clear his head. He had to think. He had to find a way out. But every step he took, the corridor seemed to stretch further. He had no idea if he was moving forward or backward anymore. There was no sense of direction. The world, the hotel, the very building felt as if it had stopped making sense the moment he stepped into this dark place. He stumbled, his foot catching on something, a crack in the floor, or perhaps just his mind playing tricks on him. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground. He gasped for breath, coughing as the air around him seemed to grow colder, denser. The hum grew louder, vibrating his bones, and someone, was watching. A shadow darted across the far wall, long and thin, a silhouette of something that should not have been there. He whipped his head around, but there was no one. No one, except for the long stretch of the corridor, endless, dark, and silent once more. Then, something strange happened. A door appeared, out of nowhere. At the end of the corridor, a door with no handle, no markings, just a solid, unyielding slab of wood. It stood alone, like a tombstone in the midst of the suffocating void. It wasn't there a moment ago, he was certain of it. Yet now, it was as if it had always been waiting for him, watching him. The businessman froze. Should he approach it? Should he try to open it? His feet moved on their own. His legs, seemingly without his control, carried him toward the door. The closer he got, the heavier the air became. The pulse in his chest grew frantic. Each step felt as if it took him deeper into the grip of something far darker than just a strange hotel. He reached the door. The wood was cold to the touch, colder than anything he'd ever felt before. It sent a shiver up his spine, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. A low whisper rippled across the space, so faint it almost seemed like part of the hum. His name. It was a voice, but not his own. "Come closer." He recoiled at the sound. It was low and guttural, a rasp that seemed to come from every direction. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. "Who's there?" He choked, his voice trembling with fear. His fingers hovered over the door's surface, but something in him screamed to stop. "Don't open it. Don't let it pull you inside." But the whispering voice grew louder, more insistent, as though the very building was breathing with him, pulling him closer to its heart. "You were never meant to leave." The door creaked open slightly, as though inviting him to enter. But it wasn't a normal creak. No, it was the sound of something ancient, something that had been locked away for centuries, groaning under its own weight. Something inside him snapped. He couldn't stand it anymore. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He had to get out now. With a strength he didn't know he had, he grabbed the door, yanked it open. The world tilted. And then, silence. The door swung open with an agonizing slowness, as though something invisible was holding it back, reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. A cold breeze swept through the gap, chilling him to the bone, and for a moment he stood frozen in place, heart hammering in his chest, breath shallow. The darkness behind the door seemed to pulse, as if it were a living thing, hungry and waiting. He should have turned back. He should have slammed the door shut and run until his legs gave out. But something in him, some unnameable force, compelled him to step forward. He didn't understand it. He didn't want to. But his body moved as though it had a will of its own, carrying him through the doorway, beyond the threshold, into the unknown. As he crossed into the darkness, the door slammed, shut behind him with a deafening thud. The sound reverberated in the silence, leaving a ringing in his ears. It was too quiet, too absolute. There was nothing but a thick, suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides, as if the entire world had just stopped. The air grew heavier with every step he took, the weight of it settling in his chest like a stone. His mind screamed for him to leave, to run back to the hallway, to find his way out of this nightmare. But the silence was too complete. He couldn't even hear his own footsteps now. It was as if the floor had swallowed them whole. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It felt alive, watching him, waiting for him to break. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence. A whisper, barely audible, like a breath against the ear. It was the same voice he had heard before, the one that had whispered his name, that had called him to the door. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice rasped, its tone low and hollow, like it came from the very walls themselves. "You were never meant to be here. You were never supposed to see." He spun around, but there was no one. There was nothing. The vast, suffocating void stretched endlessly in every direction, with no exit, no escape. He felt the walls close in on him, as though the space around him was shrinking, folding, suffocating him with its weight. "Why?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper in the oppressive silence. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, he heard the faintest rustle, like a breath or something moving. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned his head to the source of the sound. There, at the edge of his vision, just outside the reach of the dim light, he saw it. A figure. It was barely a silhouette, a shape that stood still in the darkness. Yet it felt as though it were constantly shifting, blurring the line between the real and the imagined. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its features were vague, indistinct, like a shadow that refused to be named. It stood in the far distance, just within his line of sight. But the closer he looked, the more it seemed to dissolve, to drift away. Then it spoke. "Leave now," it whispered. "You were never meant to stay." His pulse quickened. His legs refused to move, frozen by some unseen force. The figure grew clearer, its shape more defined, yet its face was still a void, empty and hollow. A gaping blackness that seemed to swallow all light, all sense of time, and all sanity. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth moved, but the scream was lost, trapped within the cage of his own throat. His vision began to blur, and the room around him seemed to bend, distorting and twisting, like a reflection on water rippling out of control. "Go back to sleep," the voice whispered, softer now, more insistent. "You were never here." It was the same words that had come through the phone, the same whispers he had heard in his dreams. But now, they were not just words, they were commands, pulling at the very fabric of his being, demanding that he obey. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the floor beneath him groaned. The walls began to tremble. The void expanded further, swallowing him whole. He tried to take a step back, but his body refused to obey, held in place by an invisible force, as if the darkness itself had claimed him. The cold began to seep into his bones, deeper than he thought possible. The room was no longer just empty. It was emptying him. The walls seemed to collapse inward, closing off his escape, and his chest tightened as though the air itself were being sucked out of the room. The silence pressed on him like an unbearable weight. He tried to scream again, but this time, the scream came out. It tore from his throat, raw and desperate. But it wasn't enough. His voice was swallowed by the darkness, and his vision darkened as well, the edges of the room blurring into a sea of black. And then, just as his body began to falter, to collapse under the weight of the force that was pulling him deeper into the abyss, the whispers returned. But this time, they were not coming from the figure. They were coming from everywhere. "Go back to sleep," the voice crooned, its words swirling around him like a vortex. "You were never here. You were never meant to stay." The businessman's knees buckled. He fell to the floor, his hands grasping at the emptiness around him, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to anchor him to reality. The darkness filled every inch of his being, and as he exhaled one final breath, he realized it was too late. He had never been there, not truly, not in this place, not in this hotel. The darkness closed in, erasing everything. His existence, his name, his reality. The last thing he felt was the sensation of being swallowed whole, consumed by the void, the silence that would never let him go. And then, nothing. The darkness had consumed him, or so he thought. There was nothing. No sound, no light, no sense of time. Only the heavy, pressing silence that surrounded him. But as his mind floated in that abyss, something shifted, subtle at first, but undeniable. He felt it, eyes, watching, not the eyes of any human, but something far older, something that had existed long before the hotel, before the city, before time itself. They were everywhere, peering out from the blackness like 1,000 tiny pinpricks of light, flickering with an ancient hunger. The businessman's breath caught in his throat as he tried to scream, but no sound emerged. His body was frozen in place, held captive by the oppressive gaze that seemed to see through him, beyond him. It was a force, not just a presence, but something intelligent, aware, and malicious. Every inch of his skin burned with the weight of their unseen eyes. He tried to move. His fingers twitched, his arms ached with the effort, but still he couldn't break free. His body no longer obeyed him. His mind screamed for release, but his thoughts were drowning, caught in the tide of the darkness. And then, from the vast emptiness, a figure emerged. A shadow at first, vague and formless. But as it stepped closer, it gained shape. A tall figure, its features cloaked in an eerie, shifting mist. It was human-shaped, yet something far more ancient, its form shifting with unnatural fluidity. The figure did not walk. It simply was, moving closer without moving at all, drawn toward him by some unseen pull. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, its voice a low, raspy echo that seemed to vibrate the very fabric of the void. "You were never meant to be here." His heart pounded in his chest, and his pulse raced in his ears. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper, though the words felt foreign, like someone else's voice slipping from his lips. The figure tilted its head, an almost imperceptible movement. It didn't answer. Instead, it stretched its hand toward him. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though time itself was bending in the presence of the creature. As its fingers reached out, the temperature in the air plummeted. He felt the coldness seep into his very bones, a bitter, biting chill that made his skin burn and his joints ache. "No," he gasped, his body recoiling instinctively, but his legs remained rooted in place. "Please." But the figure's hand reached further, closer. It brushed his cheek, and when its fingers made contact, his body convulsed in shock. The cold spread like fire, a searing pain that filled him from the inside out. His vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled deeper into the abyss, his body stretched and torn between the darkness and the light. "You were never meant to leave." The words echoed in his mind, louder now, thrumming with a terrible finality. The world around him faded to black, but as it did, the last thing he saw was the figure's hollow, empty eyes staring into his soul. The cold of the figure's touch lingered in his skin long after it had withdrawn. He could still feel it, seeping into his flesh like ice water, crawling through his veins. His body trembled uncontrollably as the darkness deepened around him, swallowing every shred of sensation, until a sound, a faint ringing, cut through the void. It was the unmistakable sound of a phone ringing, distant yet clear, almost familiar. His mind, battered and confused, clung to the sound like a lifeline. A phone where he couldn't see it, couldn't hear anything but the ringing that was starting to grow louder, more insistent. The air shifted, and just as suddenly as the dark abyss had swallowed him, there was a flicker of light, a weak, flickering glow. In the distance, far off but drawing closer. He stumbled forward, instinctively reaching for it, desperate for something to grasp, something that could tether him back to reality. But the space around him distorted with each step, stretching and warping like elastic, pulling him further from the light. He felt the pull of the ringing, pulling him down, deeper into the void, as though the sound itself was a magnet for his soul. And then, there it was, a dim, ghostly glow illuminating a small area in the blackness. He couldn't make out the source, but the ringing was unmistakable. The phone, his phone. But how? How was it here? It hadn't been in his pocket when, he'd crossed into the darkness. It had vanished when the hallway had shifted, when the hotel had swallowed him whole. Maybe it's a trick, his mind screamed. A hallucination, a nightmare. But the ringing wouldn't stop. With shaky hands, he reached for the phone, its faint glow flickering like a beacon in the dark. He picked it up, but there was no sense of relief, only dread. the sinking feeling that the phone in his hand was far more than just an ordinary device. The screen was cracked, its edges frayed as if it had been through something unimaginable. The background was distorted, the display flickering like a broken television. Yet somehow the call was still active. The screen was filled with a number, familiar but wrong. It was his own number, but there was something wrong with it. The digits seemed to pulse, moving, shifting, as though the phone itself was alive. His thumb hovered over the green call button, trembling. What was he supposed to do? Who could be calling him from this place, from this nowhere? Without thinking, driven by a force beyond his control, he pressed the button. The line clicked, and the phone hummed, buzzing with a strange static before the voice came through. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, so quiet that he wasn't sure if it was coming from the phone or from the very walls of the abyss surrounding him. "You shouldn't have answered." His heart skipped a beat. The voice, it wasn't human. It was the same whispering tone he'd heard before, the one that had called him here, the one that had guided him into the hotel and now pulled him into this dark, eternal place. But this time, it sounded different, more desperate, more insistent. "It's too late now. You've disturbed it. You've woken it." The businessman's hand shook as he held the phone to his ear, his mind spinning. "What are you talking about? Who is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking, raw with fear. The voice paused, its breath like wind through dry leaves. Then it spoke again, the words sending a chill so deep into his soul that he felt it in his bones. "Go back to sleep." The voice shifted, warping into something far darker. The static rose like a tide, filling the air, distorting the words until they were no longer recognizable. His eyes widened in horror as the voice began to chant, a low, rhythmic whisper that filled his mind with a sickening sense of inevitability. "You were never here." The voice hissed, each word coming faster, more insistent. "You were never meant to stay. You were always a part of it." The businessman's breath caught in his throat. His body trembled violently. "No!" he screamed into the phone. "No! I'm not part of this. I'm not..." The line went dead. The phone went silent, and in the stillness, something changed. The air thickened. The oppressive weight of the darkness that had surrounded him seemed to grow even heavier. He looked around, his heart racing as the shadows began to twist, slowly shifting, reshaping themselves, growing long and thin, like fingers reaching toward him from the depths of the void. Then the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't. Through the phone. It was everywhere. "Go back to sleep." His mind reeled. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The darkness was swallowing him, pulling him deeper into its grasp, as though the very walls of this place were closing in on him. He tried to scream, but the sound was trapped inside him, smothered by the air, the suffocating presence that was closing in. "Leave me alone," he gasped, struggling to breathe, his chest tightening with panic. The darkness answered with a low, guttural laugh. Not a human laugh, but something far worse, something ancient and hungry. "You were never meant to leave," it whispered. The businessman sank to his knees as the air around him seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the voice. And in that moment, he realized the terrible truth. He was no longer a guest in this place. He was part of it, and there was no escape. The world around him pulsed with a quiet, terrible rhythm, like the beating of a heart, but not his own. He could feel it in his chest, the thrum of something ancient and endless, spreading outward from the shadows. He was suffocating in it. It was suffocating him. He stumbled forward, his hands trembling as they reached out for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the void, the endless blackness that had swallowed the hotel, the city, everything. The air was so cold now that his breath hung in front of him like smoke, and the darkness pressed in on him from every angle. He could barely stand, his legs trembling beneath him, his chest tight with terror. Then, something caught his eye. A reflection. At first it was nothing more than a faint glimmer, a shard of light in the deep blackness. But as he turned, it grew clearer. It was a mirror, mounted on the far wall, its surface gleaming with an unnatural shine. It wasn't there before. The mirror. The familiar reflection. His reflection. He stumbled toward it, his feet dragging, his mind clouded with confusion and dread. As he approached, the image in the mirror seemed to flicker, as if the glass were a portal shifting between worlds. He saw himself, but not exactly himself. His features were distorted, blurred at the edges, as though his own reflection was trying to escape him. The man in the mirror smiled. But it wasn't him. It was his smile, yes, but it was wrong. The smile was too wide, too unsettling. It stretched beyond human limits, pulling his face into a grotesque mockery of joy, a smile devoid of warmth or humanity. The businessman staggered back, his heart thudding in his chest. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. His eyes were drawn to it, helpless against the magnetic pull of his own reflection. The figure in the mirror twisted its lips into that grotesque smile. And then it spoke. "You're still here, aren't you?" His voice, but not his voice. A low, hollow echo that vibrated in the air like 1,000 voices murmuring at once. The businessman recoiled, his mind racing as he fought to make sense of what was happening. No, this isn't real," he screamed, his hands trembling as he reached out, touching the cold surface of the glass. But the reflection didn't react. It remained frozen, watching him with eyes that were too knowing, too empty. "It's too late," the reflection murmured, its voice like a whisper through the cracks of his mind. "You're part of it now. You always were. You'll never leave." The businessman's heart thundered. He tore his eyes away from the mirror, but it was impossible to ignore the way the reflection seemed to linger behind him. It followed him, always just a few seconds behind. The smile twisted and warped, following his every movement. He turned around again, but the mirror seemed to move with him. The reflection was no longer confined to the glass. It was everywhere, surrounding him, twisting and stretching, feeding on his fear. The smile grew wider, until it felt like it would tear the reflection in two. He tried to turn away again, but this time, something stopped him. The darkness at the edges of his vision was shifting, shaping itself into something more. Something alive. His heart skipped a beat as the shadows began to bend and twist like hands reaching toward him. The mirror, or what it had become, spoke again. "Don't look away." The businessman's body froze, his muscles locking into place. He couldn't move, he couldn't even blink. The world was closing in around him, the shadows growing darker, the smile growing wider, stretching into a gaping maw of pure darkness. It spoke, and its words sank deep into his soul. "You've seen too much." The businessman wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but his body was no longer his own. It was trapped, frozen in this nightmare, caught in the reflection of something far darker than he could comprehend. The reflection leaned forward, its face coming closer to the glass, its breath fogging the surface, and for the first time it spoke with clarity. "You were never meant to see." The businessman gasped for air, his chest tightening as the cold of the mirror began to seep into him. His fingers gripped the edges of the frame, the ice-cold glass burning his skin. He couldn't look away. He couldn't escape. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was him, but not him. The smiling figure in the glass was something else, something that had been growing in the shadows waiting for him. His mind swam in confusion, but one thing was painfully clear now. The reflection was not the only thing that had changed. He He reached for the door, his body fighting against the invisible force that gripped him. Escape. Escape now. But the mirror's cold, mocking voice followed him, echoing in the corners of his mind. You are part of me now. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on him as though the hotel itself was alive and hungry. And just as the final, chilling realization gripped his heart, the last thing he heard was the whisper, the voice crawling through his soul. You were never meant to leave. The businessman's mind reeled, his vision warping as the world around him began to distort and flicker, like an old film reel stuttering on the edge of destruction. He stumbled back, his hands trembling as the oppressive darkness continued to close in. The reflection, his reflection, lingered in his mind, its smile stretching ever wider, its hollow eyes burning into his very soul. He had to escape. He had to wake up. His breath came in shallow gasps as he staggered down the hallway, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. The void around him felt like it was pressing in on all sides, a suffocating weight, pulling at his very essence. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The words of the reflection echoed in his mind. You were never meant to see. You were never meant to leave. The darkness was alive. It was pulling him deeper into itself, and he was powerless to resist. He turned the corner, nothing but more endless, twisting hallways that stretched beyond sight. Every door was locked, every window sealed shut. The oppressive silence that had followed him like a shadow only grew louder in his ears, deafening in its stillness. His pulse pounded in his chest, and his head swam with dizziness. What was happening? He tried to think, focus, but it was like trying to hold onto sand slipping through his fingers. There had to be an answer. There had to be someone who could help him. And then, as if in response to his thoughts, he heard it. A soft voice, low and terrified, but familiar. Sir. He froze. The hotel manager. He recognized her voice, though it sounded different now. Strained, cracked, as if she too was unraveling under the weight of this place. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat as he saw her standing at the end of the hall. But something was wrong. Everything was wrong. The manager was standing, perfectly still, her eyes wide, locked onto him with a strange intensity. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and there was a vacantness in her gaze, a coldness that hadn't been there before. She looked unreal, as if she was somehow not quite human. Sir, you need to leave, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, before it's too late. Her words hung in the air, thick with urgency, but her tone was calm, too calm for the situation at hand. The businessman's stomach twisted with unease. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His feet were glued to the ground, his body unwilling to obey, as though it knew the terrible truth already. She took a single step forward, her footfall too quiet on the carpet, as though the floor was absorbing her presence. Her hands trembled, slightly, but her expression remained unchanged. You don't understand, she continued, voice quivering with a fear she couldn't hide. The hotel, the place, it doesn't want you here. It never did. Her eyes flicked to the end of the hallway, and he followed her gaze. The shadows there seemed to grow, swirling in a way that didn't make sense. He couldn't tell if they were shifting or if they were simply waiting, but the presence was unmistakable. The manager spoke again, her words coming faster now, almost as if she was reciting them from a script. You were never supposed to make it this far. No one does. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. It's already too late for you. It's already been decided. Decided? He whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the rising hum of the darkness. What are you talking about? The manager's lips parted, but no words came out. She simply stood there, staring at him with an expression of resignation, as though she were witnessing something inevitable. I don't want to be a part of this," she said softly, her voice cracking under the weight of her own words. "But you have to leave. I can't stop it. I'm sorry." The words felt like daggers in his chest. "Stop what? What is this place? What is it?" he demanded, the words spilling out before he could stop them. But the manager remained silent. Her gaze flicked behind him, and for a moment, her expression shifted. Something dark, something otherworldly flickered in her eyes. A shadow crossed her face, and it was then that he noticed something disturbing. She wasn't alone. There were others behind her. Figures, shapeless and indistinct, emerging from the shadows, their forms half-formed, shifting like smoke, flickering between realities. He could feel their presence more than he could see them, 1,000 unseen eyes burning into him from every direction. Their whispers blended into the silence, 1,000 voices speaking at once in a language he couldn't understand. "You shouldn't have come here," the manager said, her voice now distant and hollow. "None of you should have come." The businessman's breath caught in his throat as he stepped backward, away from her. Something deep inside him told him to run, to flee, but his legs wouldn't move. His mind was clouded by confusion, by dread, by the feeling that there was no escape from this place. The hotel was a prison, and he was its prisoner. I can't leave," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, but his words were swallowed up by the growing hum in the air. It seemed to vibrate all around him, growing louder, more insistent, until the walls themselves began to tremble. The manager took one step forward, her face twisted into a grimace, something both apologetic and detached, and she looked at him one last time, as though she were saying goodbye. And then she vanished. In the blink of an eye, she was gone. The hallway stretched out before him, empty, silent, as though she had never been there at all. The shadowy figures behind her remained, swirling in the dark. But now they seemed to press in closer, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. They were no longer just watching, they were closing in, surrounding him. "You were never meant to leave," the voices said in unison. "You belong here now." The businessman's heart thundered in his chest, the rhythmic pounding mingling with the growing hum of the voices, the whispers that swirled like an oppressive wind around him. The air felt heavier now, thick with something ancient, something alive, as if the very walls of the hotel were closing in, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. The figures, the shadowy shapes, shifted in the darkness, like smoke twisting into unnatural forms, their outlines hazy but their presence undeniable. There were more now, surrounding him on all sides, pressing in from every direction. Their faces were indistinct, blurring at the edges, but their eyes burned with a cold, hollow intensity that pierced through the darkness. "You belong to it now," a voice whispered, so close it felt like it was inside his mind. "You are ours." The businessman shook his head violently, trying to escape the suffocating pressure. But there was no escape. No corner to turn, no door to flee through. The hallway had become a labyrinth, an endless spiral that was closing in on him with each breath he took. Every step he made felt like he was sinking further, trapped in an invisible web woven by the very hotel itself. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. He couldn't move faster. He couldn't think clearly. The more he fought, the more the darkness seemed to press on him, trying to crush him from all sides. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of distorted whispers, like thousands of voices layered on top of one another. "You cannot leave," they chanted, their voices rising in unison. "You are part of it. There is no escape." He staggered back, his mind racing with panic, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched on forever, its walls pulsating with an eerie, sickly glow. The shadows seemed to reach out for him, tendrils of blackness that coiled and uncoiled like snakes, curling around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the void. His legs felt like lead, his body sluggish and unresponsive, as though the very hotel was siphoning his strength. He could feel it, the weight of the place pressing down on him, draining him of everything that made him human. His limbs trembled, his mind clouded by fear and exhaustion. A sound, a scraping noise, came from the far end of the corridor. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, dragging through the silence like fingernails on a chalkboard. The businessman turned toward the sound, his heart racing, only to see the shadows at the far end of the hall shift and writhe, as though something was moving through them. It was too much. His breath hitched in his throat. He had to run. But the darkness was already there, moving too fast, growing, expanding, swallowing the hallway. He turned, his feet stumbling beneath him as he tried to escape the oncoming storm of blackness. His eyes scanned desperately for any sign of an exit, but it was all the same. Endless, shifting walls that blurred and merged, distorting reality with every step he took. And then, just as he thought he couldn't run any further, he heard it again. A soft knock, a single, deliberate knock, one that echoed through the hollow corridor, sending a shiver down his spine. The sound came from behind him, from the direction he had just fled. A knock that seemed to reverberate not only through the air, but through his very bones. He froze, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. Who could be knocking here, in this place? There was no one. There couldn't be. The hallway was empty, except for him and the suffocating, ever-present darkness, yet the knocking continued. It was slow, measured, like the tapping of a pulse. Knock, 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 and then a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, carried on the air like a breath against his ear. "You've been given a choice." The businessman spun around, his heart slamming against his ribcage, his breath catching in his throat. The darkness was shifting again, swirling in tighter spirals, the shadows bending and breaking around him like liquid. "A choice?" he gasped, his voice cracking, his throat dry and raw. "What do you mean? What choice?" The voice did not answer immediately. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint light that illuminated the hallway. It was the manager, but not the same manager he had seen earlier. This version of her was different, more distant, more hollow. Her eyes were black voids, devoid of any emotion. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her clothes seemed to shimmer as though they were not entirely real. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his, her expression blank and resigned. "You can't leave," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, as though it were meant only for him. "Not without giving something up." The businessman's pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" His voice cracked, desperate, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the hallway around him seemed to shift again. The walls bent and groaned, stretching and contracting, as if the hotel itself were alive, responding to her words. He felt the air grow colder, heavier, as if the very weight of the space was pushing down on him. "You've already taken too much," the manager continued, her eyes still dark, void-like. "But there's a price for everything, a price that must be paid." Suddenly the shadows around them seemed to pulse, the darkness growing thicker, closing in on him like a predator ready to strike. The businessman's mind raced. He had to escape, had to find a way out before it was too late. But the hotel was no longer just a building. It was alive. It was part of him now, feeding on his fear, his desperation, his very essence. "You must choose," the manager's voice echoed again, distant yet sharp. "Choose what you are willing to give up. Choose, and you may leave." The businessman's vision blurred. The weight of the choice pressed down on him like a crushing burden, and the darkness swirled around him, choking the air from his lungs. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his legs shaking beneath him. I don't understand. I don't have anything left to give. But the darkness, it had already made its choice for him. The businessman's breath was ragged, his chest heaving as the words of the hotel manager echoed through the suffocating darkness. Choose. Choose what you are willing to give up. The weight of the choice pressed down on him, suffocating him, more than the creeping shadows that now crawled across the hallway, tightening their grip on his mind and body. The shadows around him shifted again, twisting and writhing like something alive, something hungry. The darkness seemed to watch him, now, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that felt otherworldly, as if the hotel itself were a sentient, breathing entity, aware of every breath he took, every thought that passed through his mind. He could feel the eyes on him, though he couldn't see them, unseen, but ever present, crawling across his skin, like 1,000 prickling sensations, like the feeling of being watched by something too powerful to comprehend. His stomach churned, and a wave of nausea washed over him. Every step he took seemed to make the darkness grow thicker, and the oppressive presence of those unseen eyes grew heavier, closer. He stumbled backward, his hands trembling as they reached for the walls, but they weren't solid anymore. The walls had become soft, shifting like liquid, as though the building itself was melting beneath his fingers. He could hear whispers, faint at first, but then rising, growing louder, more distinct. The voices were everywhere, filling the hallway, crawling through his thoughts, circling him like a swarm of unseen insects. You cannot escape. The words echoed in his mind. He couldn't tell where they came from, or even if they were real. The whispers sounded like his own voice, but twisted. Wrong. You're already ours. The businessman squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, trying to force his mind back to some semblance of clarity. This is just a nightmare, he told himself. This isn't real. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, the world around him kept twisting, distorting, becoming more alien by the second. And then he felt it. The presence behind him. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. He could sense the weight of it, the darkness closing in on him. He turned, his heart in his throat, and there, just beyond his peripheral vision, was the unmistakable figure standing at the edge of the corridor. It wasn't the hotel manager this time. It wasn't even human. It was something else. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, cloaked in shadow. Its form was shifting, constantly warping, like smoke curling around a flame. At first, it was only a silhouette, but as it moved closer, it became clearer. The figure's face was a featureless void, a black hole where eyes should have been, where a mouth should have been. The absence of any human features was somehow more horrifying than any grotesque visage. The businessman froze, terror pinning him to the spot. The figure stepped forward, its movement too smooth, too fluid, as though it was gliding through the air, not walking. The hallway seemed to stretch, elongating in response, drawing him closer to the figure that wasn't real. Or was it a soft voice? The voice of the figure echoed through the oppressive silence. It was soft, deep, almost a hum that reverberated through his entire body, vibrating his bones. The sound was cold. It was alien. You're not meant to be here. His pulse hammered in his chest, the terror drowning his thoughts. The figure stretched its long arms forward, and the air around it seemed to warp with its presence. He could feel it, a palpable sense of weight, like the gravity of the universe, was bending, folding around this thing, this entity. The businessman's body shook uncontrollably. His mind screamed for him to run, to get away, but his feet wouldn't move. His limbs were paralyzed, his heart beating in erratic bursts. The shadows were closing in on him, swirling around his legs, his arms, his face, and then he saw it. Them, eyes. Thousands upon thousands of eyes staring at him from the darkness, from every crack, every shadow, unblinking, all-seeing. They stared not with malice, but with knowing. Eyes that knew everything about him, everything he had ever been, everything he was going to be. Leave. One of the voices whispered, choose. Another voice echoed. A third whispered, softer, almost lovingly, you cannot run anymore. The businessman's chest tightened as his breath came faster, desperate. His head spun with the weight of their presence, their gaze. The world around him was fading, warping, and with it, the last shred of his sense of self. He staggered backward, but his body was slow, unresponsive. His legs felt like they were sinking into the floor, the ground turning soft, like sand slipping through his fingers. Every step he tried to take felt more like a crawl. You've already made your choice, the figure in the shadows murmured, its voice dripping with the terrible finality of a truth that had already been written. Its long fingers reached toward him, as though reaching for his soul. No! The businessman gasped, the word barely escaping his throat. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees. His vision blurred as the shadows closed. In, the eyes on him growing too many to count, too many to escape. The world around him seemed to collapse, no, fold in on itself. He could feel the pull, the tug of the void sucking him in. The more he fought, the stronger it became. He was drowning, suffocating in the weight of it, as the darkness reached for him, and then everything stopped. The figure was gone. The voices were silent. The eyes disappeared. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness, and in that stillness, there was only one truth left. He was alone. Alone in the dark, the hotel, the void. The choice had already been made. He was part of it now. Forever, the stillness hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For a moment, he could almost convince himself that it was over, that the nightmare was ending, and he was free. The shadows had receded, the oppressive weight lifted, and there was a strange, eerie calm. His breath, once ragged and shallow, had returned to a soft, almost peaceful rhythm, but it was false peace. The businessman's body remained stiff, his eyes unblinking as he slowly became aware of the absence of sound. Too much silence. His mind struggled to reconcile what had just happened. The figure, the voices, the unblinking eyes, they weren't gone. He felt them, still there, swirling in the shadows of his mind. The dark corridor, once twisting and alive, had now solidified into something far worse, something waiting. It was then that he heard it, a sound so soft at first he almost didn't register it. The faintest buzz, like the hum of a faraway fly, but unmistakable. The phone. His eyes snapped toward the small nightstand that hadn't been there moments before. It hadn't been real. But now it was. The phone, the same cracked device that had come to him before, sat on the wooden surface. The screen flickered with unnatural light, casting long, eerie shadows across the space. It was ringing. The businessman's heart jumped into his throat. He didn't want to answer it, not after everything, after this. But his hand moved of its own accord, reaching for the phone. He could feel it, the undeniable tug, the magnetic force pulling him toward it, like an invisible thread had been tied to his soul. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the receiver. Don't answer it. His mind screamed, but his hand was already lifting it, bringing it to his ear. And then the voice. The same voice from before. The voice that had whispered to him through the darkness, that had taunted him with words he couldn't escape. It was softer now, more intimate, but just as suffocating. You were never meant to leave. The businessman's breath caught in his chest. His mouth went dry as the words settled into his mind like poison. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat tightened, closing around the words he could never say. "You belong to us now." The voice was everywhere, inside him, echoing with a chilling finality. Every corner of his mind seemed to be consumed by it. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like the ticking of a clock, marking the passage of something inevitable, something irreversible. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "No, please, I don't want this." The voice on the other end of the line only chuckled softly. "You never had a choice." The businessman's eyes flickered to the hallway, the dark, endless stretch that had once seemed like an escape. But now, it was different. The shadows had thickened again, curling at the edges of his vision. The air was heavier, colder. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a trap. His breath became shallow as the realization hit him with the force of a punch. He wasn't talking to someone. He wasn't communicating with anything human. He was speaking with the hotel, the entity that had been pulling him in all this time, the very thing that had watched him, that had led him through each terrifying step. It wasn't a building. It was something older, something alive. And it had a hunger that could never be sated. "Go back to sleep," the voice whispered again. But this time the words were different, more urgent. "You will never wake up again." A chill ran down his spine, his entire body going cold as his grip on the phone tightened. He wanted to scream, to throw it down, to destroy it, but something inside him, something deep, kept him from doing so. He was bound. His mind, his body, his very soul were all trapped, tangled in the webs of this place, of this entity. And then the voice spoke once more, its tone lower now, as if it were coming from somewhere much closer. He could feel the breath of it in his ear, even though no one was there. "You were never here. You were never meant to be here. But you'll never leave." The phone clicked. The call ended, but the voice didn't fade. No, it lingered, whispering in the darkness. Always there, echoing in the empty room like a taunting lullaby. The businessman's chest tightened painfully. He wanted to collapse, to fall to his knees and beg for mercy. But there was no mercy here. There was only the endless waiting. The hallway stretched before him again, longer, darker, and more oppressive than ever. The eyes, the shadows, the whispers, they were all still here, watching, waiting. He was no longer a visitor. He was part of it now, and there was no escape. He turned slowly, his feet heavy as they carried him toward the ever-encroaching darkness. His limbs moved in slow motion, as if his body had surrendered to something far beyond his control. It was waiting for him to cross the threshold, to step back into the void where nothing would ever be real again, where the echoes of the hotel's voice would be his only companion. And so he walked, endlessly. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long, curling into an endless dark tunnel. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the thick silence, the sound bouncing off the walls like a cruel reminder that he was no longer in control. Each step he took felt heavier, like the very air was pressing down on him, dragging him deeper into the core of this oppressive place. The walls, once smooth and polished, now seemed to pulse and shift, the faintest outline of figures moving. Within the shadows, he could feel them, watching, lurking just beyond his vision, their presence a constant suffocating pressure on his chest. The eyes, the voices, the weight of the hotel's gaze, its all-consuming hunger, gnawing at his mind. He wanted to scream, to break free, but his voice was trapped in his throat, lost to the overwhelming silence that had become the only sound in this dark, spiraling maze. As he walked, the hallway began to change. The walls seemed to warp, twisting like liquid, bending out of shape as though the building itself was alive. Alive in a way that made him feel smaller, more insignificant. Each time he looked back, the distance between him and the fading light behind him seemed to stretch impossibly far. No matter how much he moved forward, he was never closer to escape. The hallway twisted, looping back on itself, stretching out, reshaping itself as if the very fabric of reality had become an elastic band, forever taut, never letting him go. He stopped for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts, but there was no clarity. His mind was a fog, thick and suffocating, clouded by the whispers, by the voices in the dark that still taunted him from the corners of his consciousness. "You were never supposed to be here," a voice whispered, soft and insidious, curling through the silence like smoke. "But you're ours now. You belong to it." The businessman spun around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but the hallway remained empty, devoid of any clear form. The voice, however, still echoed, lingering in the air around him, too close. His breath quickened, his chest tight with the growing sense of imminence. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice trembling as he looked down the endless corridor. There were no answers, only more shadows, more darkness closing in. There is no escape. His legs moved of their own accord, his feet dragging through the heavy air as the hallway stretched on. The walls seemed to grow tighter, more oppressive, each step drawing him further into the heart of the hotel. It wasn't just the building anymore, it was everything. The hotel had become the very fabric of reality, warping, distorting, reshaping itself in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Every corridor, every door, every crack in the walls seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, as though the place itself was watching him, waiting. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A door. At first it seemed to flicker like a mirage, an illusion, but then it solidified, its dark wood glistening in the dim light. Room 8113. His room. Or perhaps it had never been his room at all. The number seemed to pulse on the door, as if alive, a reminder of everything he had tried to escape and yet drawn back to. He approached it slowly, hesitantly. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the metal cool beneath his fingertips. He could feel it, a resistance, as if the door didn't want to open, as if it were holding on to some unspoken truth, some forgotten part of him. But still, he turned. The knob. The door creaked open. The room was exactly as he remembered it. Immaculate, sterile. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains drawn tight, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. But the moment he stepped inside, the walls seemed to shudder, as if recoiling from his presence. The air was thick, heavier than before. He could feel the temperature drop, the atmosphere shifting, like a storm gathering on the horizon. But the room wasn't the room anymore. It was a stage, a backdrop to something else. He glanced back at the door, but now it wasn't the door to the hallway. It was the door to nothing. The once familiar hallway had disappeared, replaced with an endless void, a chasm that stretched far beyond his ability to see. The silence had returned, deep and profound, and he was alone, truly alone, swallowed whole by the absence of everything he had known. And then, in the center of the room, something began to stir, a shape, a form. It was not human, not even a figure. It was an idea, a distortion, a shuddering, pulsating mass of blackness that slowly began to take shape, like the negative space of reality itself being carved into something tangible. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague impression. But then it began to sharpen, to become clearer, and the businessman's stomach twisted with recognition. The reflection, his reflection, But this wasn't a reflection of himself in a mirror. No, this was something far worse. The thing in the center of the room shifted, its edges distorting as it grew, the outline of a face, his face, forming within the blackness. But the face was wrong. It was no longer human. It was a grotesque, twisted version of him, stretched beyond recognition, its eyes wide and empty, its mouth gaping open in an unnatural, silent scream. "Do you remember now?" The voice was his own, but not his voice. "You never left." He gasped, stumbling backward, but the figure followed him, its movement fluid, as though it were made of shadow and smoke, pulling itself forward in impossible ways. The businessman's heart pounded in his chest as the room seemed to collapse around him, folding into itself, becoming something far darker than before. The edges of his reality, the boundaries between what he had known and what he was now, began to shatter. The room was no longer a room. It was the embodiment of a concept, an idea that had outgrown its physical form. "You are mine now," the shadow whispered, the words dripping with finality, like a contract sealed in blood. The businessman wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But the darkness, it was already in him. He was already in it. The room was no longer there. The shadows consumed him, pulling him into the void. His screams were swallowed by the silence, his reality bending, folding into itself, until he was nothing but a memory lost to the darkness, and then nothing. The void swallowed him whole. No light, no sound, no sense of self. There was only an endless, all-encompassing blackness, a silence so complete it drowned out every thought, every shred of consciousness. The businessman felt as though he were adrift in the vastest, most oppressive ocean, a deep, bottomless sea where there was no shore to swim toward, no surface to break through. He was weightless, floating in nothing, lost to a realm that was not even a realm, just an absence. It was here that time ceased to exist, where the very concept of existence had unraveled. There was no past, no future, only the suffocating present. A moment stretched so thin it was like an impossibility. The man's mind, once sharp, now felt fragmented, disjointed, as though pieces of his soul had been ripped away and scattered into the dark. He no longer remembered who he was, what he had been, or how he had come to this place. His identity had become a distant memory, a faded whisper, lost to the vast, oppressive silence. And then, just as the last remnants of his consciousness were slipping away, he heard it. A faint, distant sound, something that pierced through the dark, barely noticeable at first. A click, soft, insistent, like the ticking of a clock, each tick dragging him forward, pulling him from the abyss, pulling him toward something. The businessman focused on the sound. He could feel the vibrations in his chest, the subtle hum of it reverberating through the nothingness. The tick, followed by another, and another. The rhythm grew faster, more insistent. It was the sound of time, the sound of life. And then it stopped. There was no more ticking, no more sound. The silence, the thick, suffocating silence returned. And with it, a question, one that had been there all along, buried deep within him, waiting for him to recognize it. What if you were never meant to escape? The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, sharper and colder than anything he had ever felt. His entire existence, the hotel, the hallway, the figure, the phone call, the reflection, had all been leading to this moment, this inevitable truth. He was never meant to leave. The businessman's body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the truth, a truth that could no longer be ignored. He was here now, forever. He wasn't just part of the hotel, he was the hotel. A ripple, subtle at first, spread through the nothingness. The blackness around him began to shift, reshaping, bending into something more familiar. The walls reappeared, slowly at first, like the pieces of a broken mirror being put back together, the cracks smoothing out, the edges coming into focus. The faintest outline of a hallway took shape, the soft hum of lights flickering overhead, and there, at the end of the hall, was the door, room 813. The businessman's legs moved of their own accord, carrying him toward it, though he had no idea why. He couldn't stop. He didn't even try. His feet moved in slow, deliberate steps, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Except now he knew what would happen. He knew that he would open the door, and that whatever lay behind it would be the same. He reached the door, his hand trembling, closed around the cold metal knob. For a moment, he hesitated. This was it. This was where it ended. He knew that now. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was exactly as it had always been. Immaculate, untouched. The bed neatly made, the curtains drawn, the faint glow of city lights creeping through the edges of the window. It was a room trapped in time, forever perfect, forever unchanging. And there, standing at the foot of the bed, was the reflection. But it wasn't his reflection. Not anymore. The man in the mirror stood there, a twisted version of himself, his face hollow and empty, his eyes black, infinite voids. He was no longer a reflection. He was him. This was the reality he had become. "You were never meant to leave," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in his mind, in his soul. The words were no longer words. They were truths. They were the hotel. They were the reflection. They were him. The businessman stood there, staring into the hollow eyes of the figure, his own eyes, and saw nothing but the endless abyss that awaited him. He had crossed the threshold long ago, had surrendered to the darkness, and now he was part of it, forever. The hotel had no end. The hallway had no end. The door, the room, the reflection, none of it had an end. He had never been a guest. He had never been alive. He had always been part of the hotel, part of the darkness that had consumed him, and it would consume him. Again, and again, and again. And so, the door closed behind him. The hallway stretched on endlessly, as it had before, and as it always would. There was no escape. There would never be an escape. And in the silence that followed, the hotel waited.